I love to camp, but after my most recent trip, I don't think it will ever be the same. I set up my tent on nice flat ground and collected some wood for a fire. The night came with all its nightly sounds, and I relaxed at the hooting owls and chirping crickets. Even better was the fact that no one else was around. Help. It was subtle. I almost missed it. The voice came from deep within the woods, and for a moment, I didn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded female, but oddly enough, I just couldn't tell. Please, help. It continued. I shined my flashlight between the bushes and walked around. To be completely honest, even as a grown man, I was paralyzed with fear. So I did the responsible thing and called the local police. That's when things went from odd to very, very weird. The police told me to ignore it. I explained to them that someone could be injured and probably needed medical attention, but they assured me otherwise. When I kept pushing and asked why, they told me, "Sir, if you ever hear that voice again, ignore it. Do not respond, and do not approach." Well, I did hear it again, but I didn't ignore it. It was almost midnight when I heard the voice a second time. I awoke to someone whispering, "Help," and it sounded like she was just outside my tent. I went out to check, and no one was there. But the voice continued from a distance. "Help, please." Again, I grabbed my flashlight and looked around the area I was camping. I was too afraid to follow the voice into the woods, especially since the authorities themselves avoided it. But I struggled morally, trying to decide whether I should go and help this person or listen to the police, who were concerned for my safety. But then I heard another, different voice. This other voice, which also seemed to be coming from the woods, was an octave lower. Unlike the first one, which cried for help, this one was loud and demanding.
"Quiet,"
the other voice demanded.
"No one's going to help you."
Once I heard that, I was sure someone was in trouble. I called the police again. When I informed them about a second voice coming from the woods, they seemed even more concerned. They told me that I should pack my things and leave the campsite immediately. They said that hearing the second, more manly voice meant that it was getting desperate. They also said that the two voices were coming from the same person. That part was bizarre and confused me, to say the least. It was at this point I dismissed the police in that area as crazy, but not before telling them off. I got angry. I told them that if they didn't get down here to come and check it out, then I would do it myself. I said repeatedly that a woman could be in serious trouble, and that it was their duty to help her. But they still refused to come. All they kept repeating to me over the phone was, "Do not enter the woods." They seemed more afraid than I was. Once I hung up the phone, I heard the voices again. A gentle, "Please, somebody help me." And then a growling,
Quiet. Nobody's going to save you. No one's coming.
It was a little past midnight at that point. I couldn't live with myself, knowing that I had the chance to save someone's life, but instead cowered. So, I grabbed some things and ventured into the woods. When I entered the woods, the voices ceased. Just like that. No cries, no whispers, and no commands. Even the owls and the crickets went away. Nothing but dancing leaves and creaking tree branches. I stopped walking and looked around. A full 360 degrees. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out. Nothing. "I'm here to help," I continued. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Still nothing. I thought of calling the police again, and then chuckled to myself. I found it strange, but somewhat comforting that I didn't find anyone out there. Nevertheless, I was still creeped out. So I packed up my things and finally left the campsite. I didn't know why the police, of all people, were so afraid. Worst case, someone was in actual danger, and we've all failed them. Best case, morons who think saying, "Help me," in the middle of nowhere is a great idea for a prank. To be honest, when I heard the voice for the very first time, I did think it was a joke. When I heard it the second time, along with that other voice, I became a bit more concerned. And same with the third time I heard it in the woods. But when I heard it again a fourth time, a week after I left the campsite, coming from inside my own house, I became very, very concerned. "Help." Work just enough to make rent. That used to be my life motto back in the day. I watched my daddy break his back for pennies in the coal mines, and quickly learned that we're expected to work harder than we ever need to. So the day I moved out of that torn-up two-bedroom shack, I let my wanderlust consume me. I traveled the world, working quick jobs whenever I needed extra cash. Courier, hog hunter, oil driller, private investigator's assistant, and alligator handler were just some of the professions I had. If there's a job out there, chances are I've done it. Would have kept going too had I not knocked up a waitress in South Padre Island around 1993. Fatherhood really changes your perspective on life. I found a job at the post office and worked there until arthritis forced me to retire early. I do appreciate the irony of it all. Now I mostly spend my time drinking beer, or watching after my grandbabies. I stumbled upon this subreddit a while ago, and I've been hooked on the stories ever since. I figured I might as well tell mine. Maybe I'll get some answers here. It was the summer of 1982, and I was chasing tail in New Orleans. I must have been around 23 or so, still in the first stage of my journey. At that time, I was working as a dog catcher, but after getting bit twice, I wasn't looking to make a career out of it. I glossed through the classified sections when a job posting caught my eye. Wanted, young man with vehicle who can work nights. Must be able to follow directions. $100 per day. $100 doesn't stretch as far as it used to anymore, but you could go to the moon with that kind of cash back then. I was skeptical of the listing as I had naively inquired about jobs that seemed perfect but ended up with some weirdo trying to grab your crotch. But my left cheek was still in pain from the German Shepherd who nearly took a chunk out of it, and my right cheek was still sore from the rabies shot. If I didn't find work soon, I'm pretty sure my mangled ass would be out on the streets. I called the number, and a man with a raspy voice answered. I explained I was calling about the gig, and I got an address to meet on the outskirts of town. I drove to a dilapidated, dirty, brown office building called Henry LeBlanc Realty. A hefty, middle-aged man answered the door and introduced himself as Hank. "You'll do, I guess," he said with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, unbothered as ash puttered down his faded green polo. We sat at a small poker table, the only place free from clutter in the cramped office space. "You got a big mouth, son?" he asked while staring at me with gold rimless glasses that hung low on his nose. "Pardon?" "A big mouth. You got one? 'Cause I need someone who can keep their trap shut." "I ain't no rat. What kind of job is this?" Hank waved me off. "I ain't asking you to do anything illegal, son. I just need someone who appreciates confidentiality." "You need me to sign anything or what?" Hank shook his head, clearly not appreciating my flippancy. "Don't need you to sign a thing. Just need to know I can trust you." "Yes, sir, you can." Hank sighed and leaned back into his chair. I could tell he was mulling over whether or not to give me the job. "Does that Cutlass out there have a radio in it?" he asked while gesturing toward my prized 1976 convertible I parked out front. "Yes, sir." "How loud does it get?" I smirked. It could wake up a whole block if I needed it to. Hank slowly nodded and rubbed the grey stubble on his chin. "Good. Here's what I need you to do." The job was weirdly simple. After midnight, I would drive my Cutlass to Metairie, a suburb outside New Orleans. I'd take a right on 50th Street and go down until I reached the dead end. Then I'd turn around and drive back up the street. All I had to do was make sure the music in my stereo was blasting at full volume. "That's it," I said, a bit incredulously. "Yep, that's it. Can you start tonight?" I flirted with some women at a nearby dive bar and closed my tab around 11:45. I hopped in the Cutlass and cruised to Materi, feeling the hot summer breeze on my face. A neon green sign labeled 50th Street appeared, and I pulled over to the corner to turn on my radio. The street was dead silent, and all the street lights were off except for the one flickering at the dead end. Come to think of it, it may have been the only light on at all. All of the homes, mostly shacks, appeared to be abandoned. Some had their windows shoddily boarded up with plywood. I flipped on the radio, and Rock With You by Michael Jackson began blasting. I let the Cutlass slowly meander toward the end of the street, peeking at the houses that clearly seemed empty. Just what the hell was I doing out here? I reached the circular dead end and whipped around, driving back down the street. As I went to turn out of the block, I could have sworn I saw the house at the corner turn its lights on. I turned the radio off and drove back to Hank's in utter silence. When I got to Hank's office, I was surprised to see him there. He was still smoking cigarettes and drinking from a cheap bottle of bourbon. His face was pale, and he looked incredibly anxious until he saw me.
"Oh, good. You're back,"
he said, the color returning to his face. "Yeah, of course," I said, perplexed as to why I wouldn't be. I stood in the door, shuffling my feet while Hank went out back.
"Here,"
he said, handing me a crumpled $100 bill.
"Can you work again tomorrow night?"
I accepted and began my routine the following evening, buying everyone at the dive bar around with my newfound wealth. The drive to 50th Street seemed longer than usual, and I missed my turn several times trying to find it again. I blamed Jim Beam. After driving in a circle for almost an hour, I saw the neon green 50th Street sign flicker and skidded into the block. The street was silent again, and the light at the end flickered incessantly. I was fumbling for a cigarette when I heard a sound that made my stomach churn. It sounded both like an animal howling and sheet metal scraping together. I turned the brights on and hoisted myself up, but couldn't see a damn thing. Then my headlights quivered, before going out entirely. I slammed my fist down on the dash and heard the hum of the lights restarting. Feeling unsettled, I turned on the radio and started blaring Physical by Olivia Newton-John, though my radio sounded more distorted than yesterday. I made my way down the street, squinting in the dark to try and see what was in front of me. I almost reached the end of the block when the Cutlass's engine sputtered and slowed to a stop. Now, I took care of that Cutlass like it was my own child back in the day. It'd probably still be sitting in my garage had I not wrecked it 2 years later in Palo Alto. So it was almost inconceivable for it to just break down without giving me some notice. Perplexed, I lit another cigarette, grabbed my tools from the trunk, and opened the hood, where I was greeted by hot steam. I shone my flashlight and checked out the engine, but didn't find anything unusual after the smoke cleared. It was like something temporarily disabled my car. Then, things started to get weird. The temperature suddenly dropped. I went from wiping beads of sweat off my forehead to nearly shivering in the middle of July. The piercing sound I heard earlier ripped through the silence of the street and almost made me jump out of my boots. My eyes darted around, as I felt I was being watched, but it still seemed like I was the only one in the neighborhood. I took a deep breath and carefully slipped into my car to slow my heart rate down. Thankfully, it turned on, and I sped out of the street, ignoring the potholes I hit on my way out. I got to Hank's and saw him pacing back and forth through the window pane and muttering to himself. Hank seemed pleased to see me again.
"Let me get your cash,"
he said, and returned with another dirty $100 bill.
"I can only pay you for one more night. Are you in?"
I accepted, now more curious about what I experienced than getting paid. I thought about prying Hank with some questions, but had a feeling I wouldn't get any answers. He didn't exactly seem like he was in the right headspace. He was still muttering to himself as I was leaving. I waited in my hotel room, not going out to any bars, to keep a clear mind. I sped to 50th Street, but still had trouble finding it like yesterday. It was almost like it didn't exist. Finally, around midnight, my headlights lit up the street sign, and I cruised into the street. The Cutlass started acting up again, cranking and jerking, almost like it was scared to move forward. I turned my radio on, but all I heard was static, followed by strange sounds I didn't recognize. I turned my stereo all the way up and coaxed my car to lurch forward. The houses looked like they were in even worse condition, with some missing roofs. The streetlights were still off, except for the one at the dead end. I took a deep breath and pushed on, gluing my foot on the gas pedal. An overwhelming sensation washed over me. I felt nervous, similar to how I feel when I'm getting my teeth scraped at the dentist. Even though I turned the volume all the way up, the static grew louder until it was almost deafening. My headlights started to dim and then shut off entirely. 50th Street wasn't a huge block, but it felt endless, with the light at the end seeming to move further and further away. I yelled in determination and slammed my foot down on the gas. I felt a gear shift and zoomed toward the dead end. Once I got there, my car halted to a stop, and the flickering streetlight went dark. I took a deep breath and shakily pulled a cigarette out of my mouth. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but the Cutlass stalled and sputtered. It was so dark, I couldn't see anything in front of me. The awful sound I heard last night pierced through the quiet evening, and the streetlight and my car turned back on. Instead of static, music was playing, though it sounded like old-timey ragtime. I didn't recognize the song. In front of me was a young woman in a tattered dress. Her back was turned to me, so I couldn't make out her face. Her head was cocked to the side, and she stood statically under the streetlight. I tried to turn the radio off, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned out my front window and tried to get the woman's attention. She slowly turned around, and I still couldn't see her face, as her clumpy, mangled, long hair covered her eyes. I could see that her mouth was smiling, but it quickly turned into a sour expression. She began to walk toward me slowly, and then quickened her pace. I shifted the gear into reverse and sped down the street. But to my amazement and horror, the woman kept pace with the cutlass. Her face was now controlled with rage. The music grew louder, and I noticed I was almost going 90 miles an hour. The agonizing noise almost made my ears bleed, and I frantically tried to steer my way out of the neighborhood. I looked forward, toward the woman, but she was gone, and I realized that my car wasn't moving at all. In fact, I was still at the beginning of the block. Only this time, the sign read 49th Street. Shaken, I drive slowly back to Hank's, eager to get some answers. But he was gone too. A $100 bill was on the table with a knife through the middle of it. A crumpled up note simply said, "Thanks, kid." I went back to my place and immediately fell into a dreamless sleep. I woke up the following day, checked out of the motel, and headed for California. I spent a couple more years wondering until I found out I was a father. Life has been a blur since then. But recently, I've been experiencing strange events, all while I'm driving. I find myself taking the wrong turns and ending up on streets I don't recognize. I drive down the street, and it'll feel like it never ends. When I notice something is wrong, I'll end up back where I started, with my car usually turned off. I'll get that feeling of anxiousness, like I'm trapped. Eventually, I'll pull myself together and get to my destination. My doctor thinks it's early signs of dementia. So do my son and daughter. But I'm still incredibly sharp, in the mind. I am worried I won't be able to pick my grandbabies up from school anymore. So this weekend, I'm going back to Metairie to look for 50th Street. I never got answers then, so maybe I'll find some now with some extra help from all of you. Just got to figure out how this damn GPS works. Wish me luck. I'd like to say we probably started out as most high school sweethearts do. Pretty popular, and practically known for just being in love with each other. We were voted most likely to get married after high school, and, well, you guessed it. We got married after high school. I mean, we were 19. We had great parents, and each had a great job opportunity on hold for us, and everything went swell. I'd say we were on the lucky side of things, but our flame, not so much. After our first daughter, things started to get a little on edge between me and my husband. To catch you up to speed, my husband is generally a very enthusiastic man. We've been together all throughout high school and married for about another 5 years. So don't think we didn't have our fun when we had the chance. Of course we did. We didn't want children until our mid-20s, and really, everything has been fine. Recently though, my husband has been acting strangely towards our daughter, Viridian. I would catch him avoiding all contact with her, and when she would crawl towards him, he would flinch and hurriedly scamper the complete opposite direction from her. He would cringe every time he saw me pick her up, or kiss her face, or even just be around her and play with her. This was odd, and it hurt quite a lot, since He was the father. This man was my first everything, and we even had our first child together. That he simply can't bear the thought of giving her a slight bit of affection. He made it seem like she was sick with some kind of disease and continued to avoid her like the plague. One night, I did the usual of putting our daughter to sleep and noticed my husband peeping around the corner of the door. I walked out of our daughter's room, but he had disappeared, and I noticed that our bedroom door was slowly being shut. I rolled my eyes and walked in our room and noticed he was in bed, facing away from me. "Honey?" I spoke calmly to him. "You've been acting strange towards Viridian recently. What's going on?" He shrugged but didn't say anything. "You need to talk to me." He sighed and finally turned. But instead, this time, he was facing the ceiling, almost in a daydreamy kind of way. I don't think she's ours," he said. A heavy silence followed, and I took notice as to how he said ours instead of his. "I'm not sure what you mean, honey." "I mean, she's not ours. Don't you find her kind of strange?" I was almost offended. Was this just not what he wanted? Is he trying to tell me he thinks our child is somehow defective? Wow. Okay. Good night. I'm not having this conversation about our daughter. I snuggled under the sheets, turning away from him, and decided not to talk to him or influence an argument for the remainder of the night. He sighed. "There's something wrong with her. Something I just can't explain." I almost started to consider what he was trying to say, but refused to believe it, regardless of how convincing he was. "I don't even think she's human." This took me by surprise. How was our daughter not human? I gave birth to her in front of doctors, nurses, and even my own husband. Was that so unnatural to him? I shrugged off what he said. I knew he wasn't trying to be offensive, and that this was something that had clearly been on his mind. I woke up again at around 4 in the morning from the sound of our daughter crying. I get up and mumble that I would check on her. When I got up to walk across the hall, I noticed her light was on. I find this odd and proceed with caution. My heart was pounding. Who turned the light on? I opened the door quietly and found my husband standing over the cradle and staring at her. He was gripping the gate really hard and just staring. Who knows what was going on in that mind of his? I walked towards him, slowly, and called his name softly, but he didn't listen to me. "Look at her," he spoke in a hushed tone. "Don't you see it in her eyes?" I crept next to him and gently put my hand on his and looked at our crying daughter. "They're not normal." I did look at her eyes, lifting her up in arms, rocking her and hushing her and humming. And her eyes were beautiful, big and brown, like mine. "She has my eyes," I said in a dreamy tone as she finally started to settle down. "They're beautiful."
"Her eyes are missing, Elizabeth."
I quickly looked up at my husband to find that he was towering over me, staring at Viridian like she was his next meal. I took a good look at him. His scleras were red, and his eyes looked so strained. He had gotten a bit pale, like as if he was sick, and he was sweating like a maniac. I took a step back, but his eyes were trained on our daughter.
Look.
I looked down, but her eyes were there. Her big, beautiful brown eyes. Nothing missing. I looked back at my husband, who was still standing and staring at her. You need to get some sleep. Go. He didn't move. I said, go. Get out of her room. We'll talk about this in the morning. He slowly looked at me, and finally walked past us and into our room. I sighed in relief. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt like we were in danger. I can't leave her alone like that again. I don't trust my husband enough not to do anything. Quickly, I shut the door and lock it, and sit in the rocking chair, falling asleep with our daughter in my arms. The next few weeks, my husband began to act stranger than usual. Viridian was crawling like she usually did, but this time she made cute little squeals when she laughed or was happy. My husband practically feared her, like as if she was a monster from out of this world. And any time she would crawl to him, or clap, or even try to give him affection, he would almost scream with fear. What I found most odd was how quietly she would watch him and just stare. Sometimes she would even try to get closer, almost like as if she was purposely provoking him. I'll admit, they were both acting quite strange, and I was even starting to consider that maybe my husband was not crazy. But there was nothing I could do to really convince myself that our daughter was the problem. And on top of that, I had asked him to get evaluated, and he refused. He claimed he wasn't seeing things, and even assumed I was under some sort of trance. I felt uneasy around my husband, like I had to walk on eggshells. I started sleeping in our nursery to make sure our daughter was safe. I tried talking to my husband about his behavior, and that he was scaring me and our daughter.
That thing is not our daughter.
What he said stung, but I said nothing, and walked away, attending to Viridian. One day, my husband finally came to his senses and began to act normal, holding our little girl, playing with her, and even feeding her himself. I finally felt at ease, and after a few days of him progressing like this, I was able to finally sleep in our bedroom. I decided it was best to not question his behavior towards Viridian over the past few weeks, in fear that I might bring something up again. I fell sound asleep until I had to wake up to the sound of our daughter screaming her lungs out. I quickly jump out of bed and run to her nursery, but she wasn't there. I ran to my room to grab my husband, but he wasn't there either. My heart completely sank to my stomach. I rushed downstairs as fast as I could, and there he was, in the kitchen with my daughter, laying on the counter, and a knife in his hand. Honey? I spoke softly, careful not to provoke him, as every bone in my body was ready to attack him. Listen to me. You don't want to do this.
If I don't, she's going to kill us. You don't understand. Don't you see the shadows surrounding us? She brought them here.
I looked, but it was just us in the dark, and my daughter shining under the moonlight, crying and screaming. There's nothing there, I said softly, inching towards him. Look at me. Let me help you. I think you might need some help, and I think we can get you what you need. You just have to listen to me. I watched as he just stared at me. He looked so tired and drained. A voice of reason is something he wanted, but didn't feel he needed.
No, I don't need the help. It's you. How do you not see it?
He slammed the knife next to Viridian. I almost screamed. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I was still walking very slowly towards them, until I was finally across from him, with our daughter in between us.
She's going to hurt us both, if we don't kill her,
he said quietly. He began to point the knife at me instead.
What if she already replaced you? She's infected you. You have the same ooze coming out of your eyes like her.
Honey, you need to listen to me. Things have gotten worse this past month. I want to help you, but you need to let me. I tried to reach for the vase, slowly, that was above Viridian's head. My plan was to smash it over his head. Everything grew completely silent, and the next moments became a blur. Aaron grabbed the knife and was ready to stab my daughter, but I quickly grabbed her and pulled her out of the way, clutching her in my arm and using the other to smash the vase over his head, and then I ran out the door. Aaron screamed in pain, and I'm sure he was darting towards us. I screamed for help. Our neighbor's light started to turn on, and once a door was seen barely opened, I rushed towards the house and begged them to help me and my baby. Aaron was gaining onto us, and the woman pulled us inside, slamming the door and locking it completely shut. He banged on the door, screaming my name, telling me he had to kill our baby. The woman called the police, and they came in less than 5 minutes, arresting Aaron and taking statements. When they arrived, he was halfway through smashing a window, screaming. This all happened a few years ago, and he was sent to the psych ward, where he was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. He was not allowed visitors, since he would constantly just get triggered and try to convince them to come after my baby. Viridian is now 3 years old, walking, and even using her words much better. I eventually moved on from Aaron. He was never getting better, and never progressed, even with medication. What I found odd was that he has had one family member who has had schizophrenia from his mother's side. However, it was his 4th great-grandmother, and it had never happened to anyone else since. He also has never had any symptoms in his entire life, nor has he ever been treated for it. My current fiancé is mentally healthy and has been treating my daughter and I so well. Although, recently, he's started acting strange around my daughter. The shop owner sat quietly behind the counter, sparing us nary a glance as we continued to browse through the little oddities and trinkets that littered the shelves of his store. I was silently grateful for his lack of attention. I hated when shopkeepers or retail assistants followed me around closely, fussing over everything I look at. I understand, of course, that everyone needs to make a living, that they may have to do these things. Perhaps it's a shop rule to not leave customers alone. But I can't help but feel frazzled and pressured, and I'd often choose to just leave instead. This shop was the stuff of my dreams. Crystals of various colors, quaint little antique lamps, oddly shaped teapots, pretty metal boxes, old jewelry, and all kinds of odds and ends were on display. For a semi-hoarder like myself, this shop was full of potential acquisitions, ready to be placed on my already brimming display shelves at home, or, more likely, to end up packed in a box in the storage area. But still, the temporary joy of bringing something beautiful and unique home, that was enough. Jason, my boyfriend, would probably nag at me about buying more things to add to our already crowded home. But he would probably also get something for himself. He was, despite his denial, also somewhat of a hoarder, though to a much lesser extent than I was. We made our way to the back of the store and saw a row of dolls lining the shelves. They were cute little round dolls, which seemed to resemble a stern-looking man without limbs. Thick eyebrows were drawn on, and intricate black lines were inked on the face. The eyes were large white circles, without any pupils drawn on. Each doll had a different colored robe painted on. One was painted red, with golden stripes, and what looked like a Chinese or Japanese word painted at the front. Another was painted yellow all around, with little squiggly red lines. One was slicked a dark green, with silver stripes. They all had a word painted on the front. These look interesting, I said, picking one up and rotating it in my hand to look it over. It seemed to be made of paper mache or some other lightweight material.
Why don't they have eyes?
My partner asked. A rustling sound came from the counter. The shop owner was standing up and smiling. He walked over to us and said, "I see you found them wishing dolls." Wishing dolls? I asked, not letting go of the one I was holding. I felt an affinity for it. Yeah, these are Japanese wishing dolls. You make a wish, color in the pupil for one eye. Then when the wish comes true, you color in the other one. Cool. Do they help with making wishes come true? I asked, holding the little doll tighter in my grip. Yeah, they're supposed to help you reach your goals. Bring you good luck. Jason saw the glint in my eye and laughed.
You're definitely getting this, aren't you?
I almost nodded, then remembered the basic purchase strategies. I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I can't afford anything too expensive. The shop owner grinned. It's just $5. I'm not making a profit off these at all. Just helping a friend sell some of his stuff from his travels. Oh yeah, this little guy is mine, I thought.
Which one of them is the most powerful?
My boyfriend asked, picking up a few of the others one by one, inspecting them closely. Oh, powerful, the shop owner said, stroking his chin. I know the one for you. He walked to another shelf altogether, reached up to the highest shelf, and grabbed a metal box down. It was rusted all over, and laced with a thick layer of dust. It looked at odds with the other items in the store. The display tended to be a little haphazard, but most items were well taken care of, clean, and definitely frequently dusted. He pulled out a key that was stuck to the bottom of the box and unlocked it. He gently opened the lid as we stared with increasing curiosity. There was another Japanese-looking doll inside, but this one was almost completely different from the other dolls. This one had limbs, for one. It also seemed to be in the form of a girl, with what looked like sewn-on black hair, cut into straight bangs in the front, and a neat straight cut across at the back. The doll was wearing an actual robe, made of purple fabric. Her eyes, too, were white, without pupils. I had to suppress the shudder that went up my spine. She looked a little creepy without her pupils and her blank expression. The black hair unnerved me too. Is that real human hair? I asked. The shop owner smiled, still holding the doll gently. Yes, I think so at least. He set the doll down in front of my boyfriend. Anyway, she's the most powerful doll there is, for granting wishes. Jason raised an eyebrow.
How much for her?
$10, which is a great bargain, the shop owner said confidently.
Alright, we'll grab these two,
my boyfriend said, pointing to the round doll in my hands and the creepy girl doll. He pulled out a 10 as I found my $5. Awesome. May all your wishes come true, the shop owner said, pocketing our cash and pulling out a paper bag to pack the dolls in.
I sure hope so,
Jason said. I looked at him, wondering what wish he had that led to that flicker of steely determination on his face. Once we were home, we found the box of markers that we had gathered over the years, each picking out a black one. We drew in one of the pupils on our respective dolls. As I drew mine, I wished for my article to be published in the online journal that I'd been aiming for. I figured it wasn't too much to wish for, and maybe the little doll would really help me out. What did you wish for? I asked as Jason looked carefully at the pupil he had drawn on his doll.
It's a secret,
he said, smiling cheekily. Fine. Anyway, good luck, whatever it is. I don't know if it's the doll, but I got it. My article was published, with my name in the byline. I was grinning ear to ear as I told Jason about it. He was happy enough for me, but I could see him staring at his doll, and I knew he was thinking about his own wish. Still hasn't come true? I asked, reining in my happiness, trying to be sensitive. He frowned, then shrugged, and smiled.
I'm sure it will soon.
When I was alone, I drew in the other pupil on the doll and replaced it on the shelf, smiling fondly at it. It seemed like a kindly entity looking over us. "Thanks for making my wish come true," I whispered, patting it on the head. I looked over at Jason's doll. Annabelle, I had secretly named her in my head. She seemed creepy enough to match the name. "Please make his wish come true too, Anna," I said, reaching out a hand to touch her, but quickly changing my mind. She still made me uncomfortable. I stared at her for a moment more, then looked away, then immediately looked back again. Something seemed different about her. I walked from side to side, trying to figure out what was different. Was it her pose? Did she get sun-bleached? Nothing seemed to have changed that much, not that I could tell. Her hair. I realized, a chill dripping down my spine. Her hair was longer. I shook my head. I must have been imagining things. I looked again at her hair. It not only seemed longer, but it was also no longer the neat straight cut across that it used to be. It seemed almost layered. Unable to suppress the shudder that crept up my spine, I turned away from her and went back to the bedroom, deciding to bury my discomfort under a mountain of work. I woke up at night to the sound of whispers. I reached out and realized that Jason wasn't in bed. Rubbing my sleep-addled eyes, I stepped quietly out of bed. I didn't know why I was being so stealthy, but I just felt like I needed to be. I was also suddenly a little bit worried about intruders. I tiptoed to the door, which was already open a crack. I pulled it further open and stuck my head out. It was Jason's voice, I realized, and felt a rush of relief. He was probably having a late-night work call with his crazy boss. That man knew no boundaries. Then I heard a response. A girl's voice. A girl's voice right in the home. I felt a mix of hurt and anxiety fill my heart. Why was there a girl in our home? I pricked my ears to hear better. She knows. She stared at me, at my hair. Cut it for me. Make it straight. The voice was saying.
She didn't say anything to me. I'm sure she doesn't know.
Jason replied. You know she can't find out. The voice said in a threatening tone.
I know. I'll make sure she doesn't. But yes, I'll cut your hair. Let me go get the scissors.
I ducked back behind the door as he walked by to get the scissors from the kitchen. My heart was pounding. It sounded like he was talking to Annabelle. But it couldn't be. But I heard her voice too. But yet, it couldn't be. I was tempted to run out and see what he was up to exactly. But at the same time, I felt frozen with indecision. What if there was another girl? But why would a random girl talk about me staring at her hair? What if he was going mad, speaking for both himself and the doll? Then what do I do? What if, God forbid, The doll was really speaking. What would it do? What would I do? With those thoughts in my head, I snuck back into bed and shut my eyes, trying to force myself into sleep. I must have fallen asleep before Jason got back into bed. I woke up the next day, and the moment Jason was in the bathroom, I walked out to Jason's doll. Bracing myself, I picked her up and turned her over. Her hair was neat at the back again, shorter than it was yesterday. It was a perfect straight cut, no longer the layered texture it was just the night before. I placed her back on the shelf. She seemed to stare right at me with her one pupil. I swore she smiled. Backing away, tense with a nameless terror that wrapped itself around me. I didn't hear Jason calling out to me until he opened the bathroom door.
"Did you hear me? I was asking if you're headed out today."
I looked at him, his words taking a while to settle in my head. "Oh, yes, definitely. I'm going out," I said. There was no way I was staying home alone with that doll while Jason was out for work. I need to work outside. I'm not really inspired at home these days. I made the feeble excuse, for some reason wanting to convince the doll that I wasn't leaving because of her. I grabbed my laptop and packed quickly, making sure to leave at the same time Jason did, not wanting to have to spend any time alone with Annabelle. I would talk to him about what I heard tonight, I decided. I got home around dinner time and walked into the house filled with the fragrance of burning candles. I smiled, knowing that Jason had likely prepared a surprise date night at home for me. Indeed, there was a feast set up at the table. The lights were dimmed, and candles burned romantically in the middle of the table. I smiled as he beamed at me, gesturing to the seat before him.
"I got us all food,"
he said. I walked over, then froze on the spot. I just stared in disbelief for a long moment, my heart thudding louder and louder in my chest. He had placed his doll at the table too, on the other seat. Jason saw the look on my face and laughed, a little too jovially.
"There's a reason she's here, babe,"
he said, grinning. He picked her up and turned her to face me. Her other pupil was drawn in now. She had both pupils, and now both eyes seemed to pierce straight into my soul.
"My wish came true,"
he announced, loudly, and Annabelle seemed to nod along with his words. He probably made her nod, I convinced myself. "Oh." I finally found my voice. "What was your wish?" He continued to grin widely.
"Mike is out. We're getting a new boss. Now I can finally get the promotion he's been blocking."
His voice held joy and a touch of manic glee. "Mike is out?" Mike is a name often spoken in our household, paired with vehement insults. Mike has been the bane of Jason's life for the past few years. Temperamental, selfish, underhanded. He had stolen Jason's credit so often and hurled so many derogatory insults at Jason that I honestly couldn't keep track. He seemed to trip Jason up at every turn.
Yeah. He...
Here, Jason darted a nervous glance at his doll.
had a heart attack this morning. He's in the hospital. They're not sure if he's going to make it. Anyway, by the end of work, the higher-ups had already sent out a notice that someone else will be hired to step in for him.
I raised my eyebrows, a little surprised at the glee that infused his voice. Sure, Mike was an ass, but I was still a little unnerved at Jason's undisguised cheer. I thought there would be a little compassion or discomfort on his part at his boss having had a heart attack. I reminded myself of how much Jason had suffered under Mike and tried to understand why he would be rejoicing. It took a bit of mental gymnastics, but I could soon really understand and empathize with how he felt. Congrats, I guess, I said, and went to give him a hug. There was a sharp pain on my chest, and I backed away, startled. The doll was still in his arms when we hugged. I looked down at my chest to see a little tear in my shirt and droplets of blood oozing from a shallow gash below my left collarbone. What the hell? I asked. Jason stared at Annabelle, and I swear, he shook his head at her.
Oh, shit, babe. You must have nicked it on a sharp part of her,
he said, sounding unconvinced himself. A sharp part of her? I glared at the doll. What part of her is sharp? Then I caught sight of the little dash of red on her lips. I reached forward, horrified, but unable to stop myself. I swiped my finger across the doll's lips, half expecting her to snap at my fingers. She didn't move, and I looked at my finger. A drop of blood was on it. Did she bite me just now? Was I losing it? Jason, we need to talk. Jason looked at me, a strange expression on his face. He seemed to know what was coming, but to also not want to have to deal with it. Then he sighed and gestured for me to sit down. Could you put her away, please? I don't want her here, I said, as firmly as I could manage. He sighed heavily, then carefully placed her back on the shelf before sitting back down at the table.
What's wrong?
He asked, sounding resigned and defensive. I don't like that doll. Can we get rid of her? I got straight to the point, unable to suppress my feelings anymore. He seemed startled at my directness. He threw a nervous glance behind me, probably at the doll.
Don't say that,
he whispered. I don't like her. I don't want her here, Jason. I understand your wish came true, but I don't want her in the house. Jason's face fell, and he made a shushing motion. I'm not going to... Before I could finish my sentence, I heard a thud behind me. I jumped up and spun around. Annabelle was on the ground. I backed away, towards the door.
Oh, damn. I must have placed her too close to the edge. Sorry. My bad,
Jason said, running over to pick her up. I knew that was a lie. I had watched him place her securely at the back of the shelf. I gotta go, Jason. I gotta get out of here. Come with me, please. I stared at him, pleading with my eyes.
I can't, babe. I need to stay here,
he said, avoiding my eyes. I heard you last night, Jason. You were talking to her. I'm scared. Can we leave?
You heard me.
He seemed alarmed.
Did you hear her?
I nodded.
That was just me,
he said, the words tumbling out of his mouth as I watched him panic.
I was pretending to be her. I was bored. I was, just playing with dolls. Like everyone did.
When they were kids, Jason. And it wasn't your voice. I know it wasn't. Honestly, I didn't know that. But I wanted to see how he'd react. His face fell.
You shouldn't have said that, babe.
Why? I said, inching towards the door. Because now you can't go. A cold voice came from the ground. The same voice I had heard speaking to Jason last night. I looked down. Annabelle was staring right up at me. I screamed and tried to make a run for the door. That thing scuttled forward in a flash, its dull limbs making a gut-twisting clattering sound as they made contact with the ground. The doll stood between me and the front door. Terrified, and having lost the last ounce of composure I had, I made a mad dash for the bedroom door instead, and slammed it shut behind me as I heard the doll clatter up to the door.
Don't hurt her!
I could hear Jason yelling at the doll. Fuck! I yelled, switching the lights on and locking the door. I stepped back from the door as the pounding began. The pounding that was near the bottom of the door. The doll was banging on the door. The door shook and juddered as the pounding went on. But it was so small. How did it hit the door this hard? The pounding stopped after a while, and I heard hushed, furious whispers. I couldn't make out much, but I think Jason was talking her down. I needed to call for help. I checked in my pocket, then realized that my phone was on the dinner table outside, and we had no landline, no spare phone in here. I huddled next to the door, holding the ceramic humidifier in my hand as a weapon. Then the hushed whispers stopped. I pressed my ear to the door and realized from the sounds outside that Jason was packing his bag.
I'll be back tomorrow, okay?
He called out. I didn't dare to reply.
Please, don't do anything stupid. Just keep calm. Everything is under control, okay?
He called out again. I didn't make a sound. I heard a sigh, and then heard the front door open. Was he leaving? He better be bringing that doll with him. A loud clattering sound swooped from the front door to the bedroom door, and I stepped away, holding the humidifier high above my head, ready to smash it down if the door opened. I'll never leave his side. That creepy, overly feminine voice floated through the door. Then the loud clattering went in the direction of the front door. and the front door closed. I heard Jason locking the front door. I felt the tightness within loosen a little as silence ensued. Jason didn't come back that night, and the next morning he was still not home. Neither was Annabelle. I couldn't call the police. No one would believe me. I didn't know what to do, if I should stay or move out. Jason hadn't answered any of his calls. I needed to stay calm. But her voice kept ringing in my head, and I kept imagining her glassy eyes as she said it. I'll never leave his side. If you're on Facebook, you'll notice they sometimes show you throwbacks they call memories. Old photos you've posted, old status updates, that kind of thing. Usually they're super cringy. At least they are for me, anyway. I used to be one of those college girls that posted everything on Facebook. Song lyrics that were a pointed message to an ex. Desperate updates, fishing for compliments, and heaps of selfies. From every angle, every expression, every hairstyle. I'd always look at them though, some weird mix of nostalgia and morbid curiosity. Or at least, I used to. Until they started getting creepy. The first memory that seemed off was a photo from May the 3rd, 2013. I was sitting at the bar, wearing a navy blue tank top with little polka dots. Except, I didn't remember ever owning a shirt like that. You might think that doesn't sound very creepy, but I remember almost every clothing item I wore in college. I don't know if it's because I have a photographic memory, or because I was very into fashion. But I remember everything. The tight red sweater that was really flattering, but a little too itchy. The denim miniskirt that I couldn't fit into after I gained the freshman 15. And the t-shirt that read, "Nothing but net," with an old-timey 90s computer on it. I had no memory of this shirt. Maybe I borrowed it from a friend. But that wasn't the only weird thing. There were no likes or comments, not a single one. And I didn't recognize where the picture was taken. Clearly it was some sort of bar, but it definitely wasn't Victorious, the bar we usually went to. I stared at it for a while longer, but eventually I had to click out of it and get on with my day. Soon after, I forgot about it. Until the next day. Another memory popped up. Without even thinking, I clicked on it. But as soon as I did, my heart began to pound. This one wasn't a photo. It was a status update. 1:43 a.m. May 4th, 2012. I don't want to live like this anymore. In of itself, that wasn't so weird. I often posted cryptic status updates, sometimes trying to drop a covert insult on an ex, other times trying to sound deep. What was odd, though, was the date. In May 2012, I was a sophomore, and I had recently entered the best relationship of my life, so it made absolutely no sense that I would be posting something like this. Maybe I was referring to my classes or something, but I remember that semester clearly. David and I had started going out. We were in the honeymoon phase, completely enamored with each other. And my classes that semester were pretty good too. I remember taking a class on folklore and urban legends in the English department. So, why did I post this? I shook my head. There was no way I could remember every single status update I'd posted 10 years ago. Maybe I was just feeling down. Maybe I'd gained weight. I'd struggled on and off with an eating disorder. Or maybe one of the cliquey girls in my dorm had been mean to me. College was an emotionally tumultuous time for me, honestly. So, again, I just pushed it out of my mind and focused on other things. But then, just a few days later, there was another one. You have a new memory to look back on today, the site told me cheerfully. But when I clicked on it, all the air sucked out of my lungs. It was a photo of my hand, with an engagement ring. I'm not married. I've never been engaged. What the hell? I stared at the post. It was dated May 7th, 2014, only a few weeks before David and I broke up. I looked at the likes and the comments. Unlike the other two posts, this one had a single like on it. From David. But I blocked him right after the breakup. I went into my settings to double check, and there was his name on the block list. Usually when you block someone, you aren't able to click on their name, if they appear at all. But when I went back to the memory, I was able to click on his name and see his profile. And my stomach fell through the floor when I saw myself in his profile picture. I was smiling, leaning into him, my arms wrapped around his, wearing a new pair of glasses I'd never seen before, wearing an outfit I'd never seen before, but clearly wearing a wedding ring. I scrolled through the profile, but everything else was hidden. No other photos, no relationship status, nothing. My mind scrambled through the options. Is this some sort of sick joke? Maybe the profile is fake. Maybe the photo is photoshopped or AI generated or something. I mean, there was no way it could actually be David. When he broke up with me, he didn't hate me. He wasn't vengeful. He was just indifferent to me. Couldn't care less about me. Which hurt more than anything. And also meant he wouldn't go through such lengths to prank me. I was the furthest thing from his mind, I'm sure. I sucked in a breath and clicked send message. The little message box popped up. My hands hovered over the keys. For a while, I couldn't decide what to say. Finally, I typed out something semi-coherent. Hi, I don't know who this is, but your joke isn't funny, and it's kind of creepy, honestly. Please take me out of your profile pic. Thanks." The message went through, and then, a few seconds later, was marked as seen. My heart pounded in my chest, but no reply came. He wasn't typing or anything. It was just blank. I waited and waited, but nothing came. I stared at the screen so long, there was a nice little afterimage burned into my retinas. Finally, I slammed the laptop shut and stormed off. I thought that would be the end of it, that the message would scare them off and they would leave me alone. But it was just the opposite. From the minute I sent that message, everything began to fall apart. Later that evening, when I got out of the shower, there was a thin, red line on my left ring finger, like I'd taken off a ring that was slightly too snug. When I woke up this morning, the left side of the bed felt warm, like someone had just been laying there. I tried to ignore it. Both things were easily explainable, weren't they? I take really hot showers, and my skin often gets blotchy red. I must have been lying on that side of the bed before I woke up. Nothing to worry about. Everything is fine. But I can't ignore the text I got tonight. The text that arrived on my phone at 11:21 p.m. from an unknown number. "Hey babe, missing you. Can't wait to be back home tomorrow."
Hey, Emma. It looks like this project is going to run late, so you'll need to pick up Josie from day camp. I'll do drop-off tomorrow morning instead.
I was just shocked by the voicemail. It wasn't that it was unlike Mike to impose on my time and expect him to fix his problems. In fact, that was a large part of the reason he was my ex. But to think I was going to drop everything and pick up some random kid after we'd split 6 years ago was over the top, even for him. After listening to the message, I called and told him as such.
This isn't funny, Emma. Just because it's my day to pick up our child, you're going to pretend that...
I cut him off and asked if he'd meant to call me or if he'd gotten involved with a different Emma. Because I didn't have a kid. Certainly not with him of all people.
Oh, so now you're going to pretend you're not Emma Sanders. You're so childish sometimes,
he said before hanging up. I blocked the number, figuring it was probably some prank. Maybe he'd finally started that podcast he'd been dreaming of while we were together, while not actually putting forth any effort into making it a reality. And this was just material for it. Not 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. My mum. Convenient, since I was about to call her anyway to vent. "Mike called and asked me to get Josie, because he said you wouldn't. What's going on?" The room tilted, and it felt like something sharp pierced my heart. Mike might try gaslighting me, I guess, but my own mother, never. Gulping back a sob, I insisted that I didn't know any Josie. I wasn't a mother at all. Why were she and Mike doing this to me? She didn't even like him, and now she was pretending we had a lifetime connection in the form of a little girl. I'm not sure how much of my speech was coherent, because she didn't respond to any of it. She urged me to stay where I was, and she assured me she was on her way. When she arrived, only the driver's door popped open. That was good. My relief was short-lived, because she stepped inside and announced that she'd dropped Josie off to play with my friend Carmen and her son. "Are you all right? Did you hit your head recently?" Genuine concern was etched on her face. I'm ashamed to admit, I grabbed my mum and dragged her through the house, demanding she show me one sign that I shared it with a child. She skidded to a stop in front of the spare room and asked me what I'd done with Josephine's things. "Jesus, Emma, when did you have time to dismantle the furniture? Wasn't Josie here this morning? Where has she been sleeping?" It's an incredibly helpless feeling when your lifelong source of comfort delivers a massive dose of pain and confusion. I wanted her out, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Even in my frazzled state, I knew that if she walked toward the door, I'd throw myself in front of it and beg her not to leave. When she put her arm around me and half walked me, half carried me to bed, I didn't object. My night was plagued with dreams of a child with a smooth, featureless face, framed by hair that had Mike's ash-brown coloring and my waves. The scent of breakfast filled the air. My mum met me in the hall and whispered that Carmen had dropped Josephine off because Mike was coming to take her to camp. She asked if I felt any better and looked crushed to learn that I still had no memories of her granddaughter. She announced that when Mike and Josie were gone, she was going to take me to the hospital. It sounded good to me. At least one of us needed to be evaluated, and I was going to ask to see the records of this supposed birth. Part of me wanted to hide in my room, but I needed to see this child. "Don't say anything to upset her, please." The statement was gentle, but with a hint of warning, and it rattled me. I was used to being the recipient of that protective streak, not being treated like a potential source of harm. I brushed past Mum and glanced around. Kitchen, empty. Living room was the same. I winced as my mum's bony elbow jabbed me in the ribs. "Say something," she hissed. "Your daughter just said good morning." I'd briefly entertained the possibility that I was afflicted by some kind of amnesia, but my eyesight and hearing were just fine. Nobody said anything. There was nobody else here to say anything. There were 2 plates of pancakes on the table. How did Mum explain that? "Josie doesn't like pancakes, Em," she patiently explained. "She had a banana." I was unraveling. My head felt like it was on fire. "Oh, and where's the pill?" "Let me guess. It's in the garbage. Just like her bed and her mattress, and all her fictional toys. Yes, I threw the bill away. I didn't know you'd need evidence of your child eating. My mum had entered the kitchen, kneeling down and circling her arms loosely in front of her, cradling an invisible body. I couldn't help it. I went over and waved my hand through the empty space. Horrified, my mum acted like she was hefting something up into her arms and rushed from the room. I felt suffocated, and the only thing on my mind was getting out of there. I went back to my room and got dressed, then took my keys. I could see my mum standing in the backyard, pacing and talking on the phone as I backed out of the driveway and sped down the road. My trip ended at a hotel in the next town. The constantly ringing phone sawed away at my remaining shred of sanity. I tried to find something fun on TV for a distraction, but that failed because the only available channels were all news stations, and they were all talking about some man who'd been found pulverized in his pool. I called the police and got a wellness check for my mother. But when I told them my name, I was told something that nearly made me pass out. Miss Sanders, I'm glad you called. Please just come down to the station and talk. We know it was a terrible accident. We know you didn't see her. We just want to make sure you're safe and that you didn't do anything to compound this terrible tragedy. Apparently, when I left the house earlier, I backed out over Josie. Please, don't upvote this post. It takes a piece of me every time you do. This isn't a joke or a desperate ploy to get attention. I made a deal with a demon, and it tricked me. It's my own fault. But every time this post gets an upvote, he carves a piece of flesh the size of a 5-cent piece off me. I just wanted to be a good writer. I dreamed of writing a novel with romance and action, my two favorite subjects. I'd even wanted to post them on Reddit, under a romance or action story subreddit. But try as I might, I could never finish a story. I would sit in front of the computer for ages, trying to work out what to write next, how to give a character a compelling story arc, or how to create a realistic romantic encounter. But I could never do it. I read books on how to structure a story and watched hundreds of hours of YouTube on how to overcome writer's block. I even tried ChatGPT to fill in the blanks. You know you are doing bad when AI tells you it doesn't understand. When my prayers went unanswered, I was at my rope's end. I just wanted to throw in the towel and give up on my dream. But then, something did answer my prayer. Something dark. Something evil. At first, I thought it was a dream. I never saw it directly, just in reflections. I would catch a glimpse of it, a dark, wispy shadow in my glass door. or see a dark shape move in the reflection of my stainless steel fridge. A horned figure standing behind me in the fogged-up bathroom mirror. But every time I would turn to look at it, there was nothing there. Then it messaged me on Reddit. I won't tell you the username, as I don't want anyone trying to look it up. This is how the conversation went. Hi. Looks like you could use some help. Hi. Who are you? I'm the answer to your prayers. You asked for help with writing, and I am here to give you that help. I know you've seen me around your place. I've been watching you as you struggle. But I am here to put that struggle to an end. I replied, Okay, is this some kind of joke? Not at all. Here, let me prove it to you. As I received that message, my TV turned on to a static snow image. Then, a horned silhouette became slightly visible, and it spoke through the TV. You believe me now? Are you an angel? I asked. Once. Now I am different, but I am still here to help. I will help you write the greatest stories you ever dreamed of, and all I ask for is payment. Of course. I'm willing to try anything about now. I can PayPal or Venmo. No. A small payment in flesh. The size of a 5-cent piece is all I ask. And for that, I will give you the power to create literature art. The only catch is, once you agree, you have 24 hours to upload your first story, and it must meet their guidelines, so it cannot be removed. What happens if I can't? I struggle so much to finish anything. I'm worried I'll fail. It responded, I will remove all barriers and clear your mind. You will be the greatest writer in modern history, if that's what you want. Yes, that's what I want. Okay, you have a deal. Done. As an upfront payment, I am going to take a piece of flesh now. A searing pain on my chest hit me suddenly. I lifted my shirt, and a small 5-cent sized piece of flesh had been carved out of me. I quickly opened the drawer and fished out a band-aid, covering the bleeding cavity from where the chunk of flesh had been removed. I started to think that this was a bad idea. I mean, to be honest, I didn't think it was true or would really happen. But that thought was washed away as story ideas started to flood into my mind. And just like that, I was writing. My mind was clear, clearer than it had ever been. My stories were practically writing themselves. I opened my folder of incomplete stories, and within 6 hours, I had finished, edited, and proofread 5 stories. And they were good. Like, real good. I couldn't believe it. I was struggling to work out what story to post first. I had a beautiful romance story that would make hardened criminals cry, and action-packed adventures that would make the greatest Hollywood directors sit up and take notice. I opened the chat again. I wanted to thank this savior, this being that granted me this clarity. But as I was scrolling through the chat, I noticed something odd that I missed the first time. It was a gap in one of its messages. No. A small payment in flesh. Gap. The size of a 5-cent piece is all I ask. And for that, I will give you the power to create literature art. I hovered my mouse over it, but nothing came up. So I copied the chat and pasted it into Word. I highlighted all of the text, and then selected black font. That's when I realized how much of a mistake I had just made. The gap had some hidden words, which I had unknowingly agreed to. The message truly read, No. A small payment in flesh, per upvote. The size of a 5-cent piece is all I ask. At that point, I knew the grave mistake I had just made. A new message popped up. You have 18 hours left to upload. Wait, you never told me what happens if I don't upload something within 24 hours. Oh, I have faith that you will. But just in case you don't, I will skin you alive and boil you for eternity, without the ability for you to die. That last message came through 17 hours ago. I have spent that time trying to work out a way out of this deal, and the only thing I can think of is to plead with you, people of the internet. Please, do not like or upvote this post. Don't downvote it either. It's not worth the risk. I am here asking for help, for advice. Has this happened to any of you? How did you beat it? If you can't help, just ignore this. Keep scrolling. And never, ever accept help from a demon. When I was in college, I decided to tag along on a spontaneous trip to Thailand with a group of girlfriends. Despite my fairly serious travel and flight anxiety, the idea of 10 days in gorgeous Phuket seemed like the experience of a lifetime, a memory that would stay with me forever. In a way, I was all too correct. The first few days were incredible, drinking fruity cocktails on private beaches, tasting the authentic Thai cuisine. And I won't lie, I may have had a bit too much fun in the bar scene. However, what I was really looking forward to was the excursion on the 5th day. A kayaking tour and booze cruise through the caves of Phang Nga Bay. The morning of the excursion, we all loaded up on beer and wine coolers and excitedly hopped on a bus towards the tour company. The boat was 3 stories, the food was exceptional, and the views were second to none. The 8 of us fried in the sun on the roof of the boat, taking pictures to post on Instagram and tossing empty bottles into bins. All anxiously awaiting what we all had decided would be the best part of the trip. The boat slowed down beside a massive array of cliffs, and we all began to search the flat mass of flat rocks for whatever cave we'd be entering. But we saw no opening. I asked one of the guides where the cave was, expecting a typical large tunnel to enter. Instead, he pointed to a small, maybe 3 foot tall and 7 feet wide, opening at the base of the cliff. My breath caught in my throat at the sight of it. I asked if maybe the tide was too high. There was no way we're going through that. I was met with a smile and a chuckle from the guide, who returned to preparing the kayaks. We all split into groups of 4, 2 girls and 1 guide per kayak, and loaded onto the yellow inflatable boats. I grabbed the arm of a girl who looked equally as nervous as I did, and asked if she'd like to go together. We quickly realized we were the only ones feeling the anxiety of such claustrophobia. We all settled in, armed only with bikinis, sunglasses, and a stranger with a paddle, and moved towards the first cave. My kayak led the pack, heading in first. The guide instructed us to lay flat on our backs to enter the cave. I laid my head on the legs of the girl behind me and struggled to breathe. We entered the mouth and were struck by a gorgeous opening, beyond tall enough for us to sit comfortably. The walls had a crystalline surface that was illuminated by the headlamp our guide aimed around. Stalactites clung from the ceiling high above us. The guide slapped the water, and hundreds of glittering blue spots filled the space next to us. Bioluminescent plankton illuminated the room like stars. Seeing the amount of space and intricate scenery, I began to relax. As we moved forward, the guide instructed us to lay back again. I looked forward and realized that we were entering a tight tunnel. My anxiety spiked. I've always been claustrophobic. I can't even stand elevators, let alone this tunnel that didn't even look like it could fit the kayak, especially not with us atop it. I asked the guide how long this particular cave was. He told me that we would be through in about 5 minutes. It's strange how much time slows down when you enter survival mode. 5 minutes can seem like an hour when you believe your time is up. The walls of this section were somehow even tighter than the entrance. It was pitch black, save for the occasional view from the headlamp. I had to squeeze my shoulders back and suck in my stomach as far as I could, but I could still feel the presence of solid, thick walls suffocating me from all sides. My hot breath bounced back into my face off the stone directly above me. I tried to focus on the sounds, the moving water, the slap of the paddle behind us by our guide, who, even completely horizontal, was still skilled enough to keep us moving forward. Until the sounds of water stopped. So did the boat. I could hear rocks scratching rubber and my own rapid breathing as I realized we had gotten stuck, lodged against the tight walls of what I believed would surely become my tomb. In an attempt to relax, I released my stomach. Immediately, I felt a piercing sensation from a low-hanging stalactite that attempted to bury itself in my gut. I let out a half gasp, half yelp that must have startled my guide, because I felt quick movement, heard the crunching of glass against stone, and then the small amount of light provided by the headlamp was gone. A string of Thai, what I can only imagine were harsh curse words, followed. Then, more scraping and paddling, frantic this time, trying to release us from the rocks, save us from what seemed like the fate of being buried alive in a grave of crystal and salt water. A stone dislodged in front of me. As it splashed, the shallow water erupted with the glow of plankton. In that short moment, I looked to my left. Beside us was a small tunnel at eye level. What I saw in the brief flash of blue light will stick with me forever. To say it was human would be generous, though it looked like it may have been once. It squatted on its mangled feet, its arms stretched out for support. Its hands looked puckered and pruned, as if soaked in water for so long that the skin could fall off the bone. Dirt and weeds were embedded in its long, razor-sharp claws. Its skin was ghostly pale, with deep green and purple lesions littering its skin. The body was so thin you could distinctly see ribs and bone through stretched skin. Dark, wet, matted hair hung low, covering most, but not all of its face. A face that will haunt me for a lifetime. The eyes were pure white, with no pupil, and cheeks so sunken it almost looked skeletal. It had no discernible nose, just a hole, as if cartilage had fallen off. I swear on my life, as I caught that glimpse, the thing smiled at me. As it did, it revealed a bloody mouth with yellow teeth like knives. The lack of lips led me to believe the creature may have chewed them off itself. I tried to scream, to call out, to do anything at the sight, but all of the air had escaped my lungs. I struggled to inhale as the guide finally dislodged the kayak and sent us forward. My mind raced at the thought of what I had just seen, what I might say or do. With my mind going a mile a minute, the only words I could manage to breathlessly get out were to ask if there were any animals in the cave. Only crabs and bats, the guide told me. Well, and us. And he kept paddling along. We exited the tunnel into a more spacious area. As I was able to sit up again, I started to tell myself that the being must have been a trick of the light, a hallucination created by my fear of the caves and tight spaces. That was when, still surrounded by pure darkness, I felt two hands grip my shoulders. I let out a shrill yelp before my friend, of course it was just her, leaned in my ear and asked the worst question I've ever been asked. You saw it too, didn't you? Blazing hot tears filled my eyes. It felt like all of the air was sucked out of the room. I leaned over the side of the boat and emptied the contents of my stomach. All I could repeat, over and over again, was that we had to get out. We had to get out. We had to. The guide, who must have mistaken my panic for claustrophobia, told us that the only way out was forward and that we were halfway through. The cave was a perfect U-shape, in and out on the same cliffside. The guide began to turn us to the left, towards the exit. 2 minutes, 30 seconds, and a few tight spaces, and I'd be out. I'd be safe. I'd have another wine cooler to calm the nerves, and I would never think about this cave again. That's how it would be. That's how it had to be. We moved forward, out of the base of the U, into another small tunnel on the final stretch. Instinctively, I once again lay back and held my breath, making my body as small as possible through the small, smotheringly confined space. I sobbed silently to myself, wanting nothing more than to be back on the spacious boat on the gorgeous sea that I will never see the same again. We float for about 30 seconds more, and then once again, like clockwork, I hear the scraping of rubber and rock, feeling us stop our forward motion. A grotesque and distorted hissing noise fills the air, and I feel every hair on my body stand on end. I'm even more horrifyingly aware of how small the space is as the hairs on my arms stretched out to touch the walls that trapped me in my own personal hell. A bright light strikes the side of my face. I look over and see the headlamp of a guide from one of the kayaks that trailed behind us. The light finds us through a tunnel in the bend. The same tunnel where I saw that thing just minutes before. It all happens so quickly. There's a scream, and the loud pop of an inflatable kayak as my guide begins to scream at us. Don't look left. Whatever you do, don't look left. He's only a split second too late as I see the nightmarish abomination leap at the other kayak from the tunnel, as the girls and guide scream for mercy. I shut my eyes as tight as I can, but there's no point. In an instant, the headlamp of the other guide goes dark. The only light illuminates from the glowing blue water of the startled plankton. The sounds seem to never end. The screams stop, but they are quickly replaced by thrashing and ripping. I hear the carving of skin, the crunching of bone through those razor-like fangs. The once happy laughs of my friends have been replaced by gurgling and sputtering, gasping for any last breath they can find. Sounds that I will hear forever. Every time I close my eyes, every night while I try to escape to sleep that is riddled with nightmares. The hellish sounds fill the entire cave, and then silence. The loudest silence I have ever heard. And it was over. Including the guides, 12 of us entered that cave, but only 9 came out. The first 3 kayaks returned us safely to the boat as the guides returned to the cave, looking for our fallen friends. To no avail. After hours of searching and sobbing, the sun set, and we were forced to return to shore, silent, in shock. We gave our statements to the Thai police before returning to our hotel. For my own sanity, I lied and told them that I saw nothing. I couldn't retell what I saw and heard until now. I regret it every day. A proper search party was sent to the cave, but they found nothing. There were no answers, no signs, no indication that they were ever there. No sign of anything. For the safety of others, the cave has since been sealed. Forever their tomb.
My name is Mark, and I'm a detective. Not like on the force or anything. A private eye. Like in the movies. It's kind of the family business. My grandfather was one, and my dad, and I grew up in that world. And it was only natural that I got into it too. It's not as exciting a job as you would think if you go by Hollywood. It's mostly sitting in your car for 10 hours at a time, waiting to take pictures of cheating spouses, to show the spouse who is paying you, to prove that they're being cheated on. It's kind of a bummer sometimes. People get married, they get cheated on, they get divorced. So often, kids are caught up in the middle of it all. Now and then, something crazy comes your way though. Or something exciting. I want to tell you guys about one of the crazy ones. The craziest. It happened a few years ago, and sometimes I still can't convince myself that it was real. I'm not religious, and I don't believe in the supernatural. At least, I didn't, until Benson Street. Now, I'm not so sure. A woman got a hold of me in August of 2020. She had lost contact with her sister. She came into my office and spun a pretty crazy story. Her sister lived in a small town in Michigan called Franklin's Green. My client was named Shelley. She was 62, and her sister was a little younger. They were close and spoke almost every day. But for the last month, her sister hadn't answered her calls. And then Shelley did a little digging, and came across a couple of news stories that were a little hard to believe. It said that everyone who lived on Benson Street had gone missing. There were 8 houses on the dead-end street, and every person who lived in them had seemingly vanished into thin air. I mean, I read the stories myself. After Shelley left, I did my digging, and she was right. It was crazy, and I was a little surprised the story hadn't gotten more attention. I called Shelley back that night and told her that I would be taking her case. I didn't usually travel that far for a job, but the next morning, I packed a few things up and left my office in Cincinnati. Hours later, I arrived in Franklin's Green. There was a little crappy motel, and I checked in and then headed right for Benson Street. It was smack dab in the middle of a little sleepy neighborhood, lower middle class, mostly ranch-style homes. The entrance to Benson Street was completely roped off with yellow police tape, stretched between a telephone pole and a stop sign. I parked nearby and decided to canvass the surrounding streets. I knocked on doors, stopped, and chatted with an old man out watering his garden, and stuff like that. No one had much for me. Everyone on Benson Street had simply been there one day, and gone the next. No one knew why. The people I spoke with were happy to share their theories with me. The street was full of drug addicts who had all gotten high and wandered off. There was a gas leak that killed everyone in their sleep, and the gas company removed their bodies to avoid suspicion. Nothing I was told seemed very likely. By the time I had spoken with a number of people, the sun had gone down. I debated going back to the motel and starting the next morning, but I thought I would at least check out Shelley's sister's house. I grabbed my flashlight from my duffel bag in my trunk and ducked under the yellow tape. Shelley's sister was named Mary, and she had been married to a guy named Tom for nearly 40 years. They had 2 children who were grown and lived out of state. Shelley told me they were worried about their mother and father as well, and hadn't been able to reach them, nor had Mary and Tom reached out to them. Mary's house was the third on the left, and I did a slow circle around it, shining my flashlight in the dark. I'm not sure what clues I was looking for, but there were none to be found. One thing that took me by surprise a bit was just how big the houses on Benson Street were, compared to the rest of the neighborhood. I made my way back around to the front of the house and went up onto the porch. I tried the doorknob and was surprised to find the house unlocked. I was sure the cops had been through all the houses on the street. But as I stepped inside, I saw no evidence of this. I worked through the ground floor slowly, resisting the urge to turn lights on as I went. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself, and one of these houses with lights burning in every window would be very noticeable to anyone who drove by Benson Street. The home was eerie. It really was as if Mary and her husband had simply vanished. There was a half-empty can of Coke on the kitchen island, and dishes that needed to be washed in the sink. A cloud of flies buzzed here and there, eating food residue that had been waiting to be cleaned away. A door in the kitchen opened up to a set of stairs leading down. I decided to save the basement for last, and went upstairs instead. I worked slowly, just as I had on the ground floor. There were 4 bedrooms. The master bedroom was the married couple, obviously, and another of the bedrooms was a guest room. The 3rd bedroom had been converted into a home office. The laptop on the desk there was dead. I found the charger and plugged it in, then went into the 4th bedroom, which had a treadmill and an exercise bike. I had saved the master bedroom for last, and worked my way through the dresser there, finding nothing but clothes. The closet was another story. There was a shoebox up on the shelf, hidden underneath folded bed sheets and a hand-stitched quilt. I pulled the box down and opened it, surprised to find a knife. The knife was ornate, the blade curved, and the hilt made of bone and wrapped in leather. Etchings had been carved into the bone, and I unwrapped the leather to see better. I can only describe the etchings as strange runes, almost like an alphabet. They were very letter-like, but damned if I knew what they meant. I took pictures of the knife and then replaced it in the box and hid it once again. All that was left now was the basement, and I was surprised to realize I had been putting it off, even dreading going down there. I had no choice though, and headed down into the kitchen with heavy steps, and then down once more. I swept my light across the open basement. It was unfinished,
the walls cement, as well as the floor. Small frosted windows sat near the beams of the floor above. The basement had just been used for storage. I found cardboard boxes filled with Christmas decorations, and a small wooden chest filled with important papers like birth certificates and old pay stubs. Above me, a creak. I froze and turned off my light. A thud. Another creak. Someone was walking on the ground floor. I wrestled with what to do, and I could feel my heart thumping wildly in my chest. Did I call out? Admit that I was trespassing? Did I go upstairs and try to sneak out? Did I stay and hope they didn't come down? I crept slowly to the foot of the wooden stairs that I had come down. I had left the basement door open and cursed myself for my stupidity. I listened to the footsteps above me. Sweat stung my eyes and I wiped it away. The footsteps came into the kitchen, and I moved away from the bottom of the stairs. I looked for a place to hide, and wedged myself in behind a stack of plastic totes along the wall, just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. I held my breath. I peeked out, but it was so dark down here, I couldn't see much more than a dark shape. It paused at the foot of the stairs, and then turned and went back up. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. I didn't hear any movement upstairs. I left my hiding spot and went to the foot of the stairs. I took them slowly, exited into the kitchen, and then shut the door as quietly as I could. I paused there for a long time, listening. If anyone else was still in the house, they weren't moving. I hurried to the front door and pulled it open. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me, rushing off the porch and into the middle of the street. I turned and looked at the house, and felt sheer terror as my eyes swept up to one of the windows that looked out into the street from the master bedroom. Someone was standing there, staring right at me. The same dark shadow I had seen in the basement. I turned and ran down the street to my car. I rushed to the motel and went inside my room. The locked door wasn't enough. I pushed the heavy circular table that served as an eating area in the small room in front of the door too, and found myself exhausted. I fell into a restless sleep. I dreamed of a dark shape and of that curved blade. When I woke the next morning, I thought about going to the local police, telling them who I was and who had hired me. But in my experience, most cops don't take kindly to private detectives, and I was afraid they'd keep me from Benson Street. So I showered, dressed, and headed back over. I felt a little more comfortable in the daytime. I went back into Mary's house and looked for evidence of someone else having been there the night before, but found none. Then I went back outside and started at the end of the street and tried the front doors as I moved around the cul-de-sac and went up the other side. A lot of the doors were locked, but 2 were unlocked. The houses I could enter were a lot like the ones I had been in the night before. It seemed as if whoever had lived there had just vanished, or up and left without taking anything. In the first house, I found a full set of luggage, and it didn't seem like the overstuffed closet and drawers full of clothes had been touched. No one had packed for a trip. In the other house, I found something rather alarming. It sat right out on a bedside table in the master bedroom. A knife, exactly like the one I had found in Mary's home, hidden away. The same bone handle, the same runes carved into it, the same curving blade, sharp as can be. I went back to the middle unlocked house and began to search. It took me a couple of hours, but then I found it, stashed away in a floor vent. An identical knife. I left quickly and went to my car. I found a little diner and stopped for lunch, and sat at the table with my phone, searching online for any sort of information I could find on the knives. I searched for news about cults in the area, and came up with nothing. I had taken pictures of the knives and tried to find anything about the runes, but ran into a dead end there as well. After lunch, I went back to Benson Street and stood on the sidewalk. I was fairly sure that if I broke into the locked homes, I would find knives there as well. I walked slowly past the houses and paused at the end of the street. Past the end of the road were woods, mostly evergreens. A dirty little path cut from the end of the street and through the lawns of the two homes in front of me and to the trees. I started down the path. It was well worn and continued well into the woods, curving around trees and overgrown plants. I walked along it for nearly half an hour before I saw it. The church was old and made of wood, squat and slanted. A spire went up over the front double doors, a strange symbol that resembled an inverted cross, made of what looked like iron nailed to the front. I went to the building and tried the doors. They opened freely. Surely the police hadn't missed this strange building. Inside were a few rows of pews and an altar at the back of the large open room. A large leather-bound book with yellowing pages that curled at the corners sat open on the altar, next to a silver cup, stained red inside. I couldn't read the book. It was written in the same strange runes that were etched on the handles of the knives. I took pictures of a few pages and hurried back outside. Standing in the church, I had felt a growing sense of unease, almost like I was being watched. I thought of the shadowy figure that had been watching me from the window of Mary's home and shivered. I went back to Benson Street and rushed to my car. I drove to the safety of my motel and went in and locked the door, barring it once more with the stable. I called Shelley and told her about the church. She hadn't ever heard her sister or brother-in-law speak of it. I hung up on her, and it struck me for the first time that the sisters were named Mary Shelley. One of the parents had a literal sense of humor. I called Mary and Tom's two children next, one after the other, and asked about their parents' religious stances. They told me that their parents were Catholic, but not practicing. Church hadn't been a thing in their lives as kids. I sat on the end of the bed and scrolled through the internet, trying to find the strange inverted cross sigil I had seen on the front of the church. It took hours, but eventually I found it. I clicked on the picture, and it took me to an amateur website that seemed to be all about various demons and hellspawn. It was the symbol of something called the Nameless One, and it was said he would bring his followers great wealth and power in exchange for sacrifices. I thought immediately of how the homes on Benson Street were much bigger than those nearby. I set my phone aside and shivered. The whole thing was freaking me out. I do not scare easily, but that job I had taken was proving to be a strange one, and I couldn't get over the feeling that I was messing with something I shouldn't be. When the sun went down, I drove to the local bar, a place called Mel's. It was busy, and I took a stall at the bar and had a beer. Over the course of a few hours, I spoke to a few townspeople about Benson Street. I was truthful with who I was and what I was doing. A lot of people clammed up when I brought up the street. I didn't ask about the church or the symbol I had seen, but I did ask about the houses and how they seemed to be so much more expensive. One old guy gave me something like, "Everyone on that street was a weirdo, and we all know it. Wherever they are, it isn't good." Another patron of the bar brought up how people in the area had been going missing regularly for the last few years. Drifters and homeless folk. No one important. No one who got the police involved very much. Back at my motel, I called Mary and Tom's oldest. I asked if they had grown up in the house on Benson Street, and he told me no. His parents had bought it a few years ago after Tom had retired a few years early. I thanked him and hung up. I was asleep when a thump at my door woke me. I went to the peephole and peered out, but could see no one. Fear gripped my heart with its icy hand. I went to the window and carefully pulled the blind back at the edge and looked out into the parking lot. A line of 4 people stood there, right in the middle of the black pavement, staring at my room. It was dark, and I couldn't quite make out who they were, man or woman. I couldn't tell. I had no idea of age. They wore dark clothing, robes of some sort, with the hoods pulled up. As I watched, they turned as a group and walked out the lot across the street. I watched them until they faded into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went back to Benson Street. I was drawn to it, or more specifically, to the church in the woods. I hurried down the path and entered that strange building again. Someone else had been there. The book and cup that had been on the altar were gone. I did a more thorough search of the building and found a small trapdoor just behind the altar. I lifted the hatch open and shone my flashlight into the hall. A rickety wooden ladder led down 10 or so feet to a dirt floor. I took a deep breath and started to climb down. There was a tunnel, curving away to the right when I got off the ladder and turned around. I kept my light on and crept forward. It twisted this way and that until it opened up into a large chamber, and I found the people who had lived on Benson Street. They all lay dead on the dirty floor, nude, with their arms crossed over their chests I needed to tell the police. I turned and came face to face with a man in a hooded robe.
"Intruder!"
He screamed at me, and I pushed past him and ran. I knew he was chasing me. I could hear his heavy footsteps right behind me. A chill blew through the tunnel as I ran. Voices burst forth from nowhere, speaking a language I couldn't understand. I got to the ladder and began to climb. I got to the top and rolled out the hole, and turned and used my foot to slam the door shut. There was no way to latch it. I stood and turned, shocked to find 100 or more candles had been placed throughout the church, all burning. So too were more robed figures. One came at me as the trapdoor behind me burst open, and my original pursuer came through. I tussled with the new robed figure. He wrapped his arms around me, but I shoved him off into the altar. The candles there shook and then fell. A musty carpet that led from the altar to the front door lit up immediately. Soon the room was alive with flame. The robed figures howled, and I was forgotten as they attempted to put out the fire. I ran for the door and burst through it into the woods. It was still morning. The sun hung low in the sky, the light getting cut off by many trees. I turned and looked at the church. It was burning. No one came out after me. I turned and ran for Benson Street. I didn't stop running until I made it to my car. I drove to the motel and checked out and packed up my things. I didn't call the police until I was an hour away from the town. I told them what I had found and hung up before they could start asking me questions. Then I called Shelley and told her everything I had found. The knives, the church, the robed figures. I could tell she didn't believe me, and she started to cry and curse me out for not giving her something real. I understood though. I hardly believed the words coming out of my own mouth. In the end, I didn't speak with Shelley again. I didn't go after her for the unpaid balance she owed me. A week or so later, at home, I searched the internet for any sort of news story about the church behind Benson Street, but only found one little article that had been written in the local paper about a fire in the woods there. It didn't mention the church. In the 3 years since then, I've seen robed figures a handful of times. Sometimes I don't trust my own eyes and wonder if I'm hallucinating. I don't think I am. I think the followers of the Nameless One are keeping an eye on me. They never approach me. They never threaten me. But they are there, right? They are watching. My wife, Laura, and I moved to Haidenfield late May of this year. Neither of us knew too much about the town before we moved in. Laura was a traveling nurse and decided it was finally time to settle down at an actual clinic and get more sustainable hours. Haidenfield just happened to be the closest town and had the most affordable houses near her clinic. As for me, I just create mock-ups of websites for different companies. All my work is done wherever my computer is. So, I really didn't mind moving wherever Laura felt happiest with. So, when Laura told me about Haidenfield, I was just as excited as she was. The whole town basically consisted of a small subdivision with a connected cul-de-sac, the only other building being a small family-owned department store down the road. The average age of a resident in Haidenfield was well into their late 60s and 70s. It was quiet, old and secluded, surrounded by a beautifully dense woodland. It was perfect for just the two of us. Our house was a 2-story continental, nestled right into the center of the main cul-de-sac. It had a bit of age to its design, but it was well kept and maintained. Besides, it was a cheap buy too. The previous owner had passed away from natural causes a few months prior. Her name was Nancy. She made it until 73. The in-home death didn't bother Laura or I very much. Seeing death was part of Laura's occupation. And for me, I guess the thought of death never bothered me much. Our move-in date was a pretty standard affair. Our whole previous life had fit into a mid-sized storage van. We started unpacking our belongings from the van sometime in the early afternoon that day. It wasn't until the late evening that we had all the boxes inside our new home. To see all of our lives' possessions laying on the floor and not even filling up a single empty living room left us feeling some sort of way. I'd like to say it was the feeling of hope and excitement for having a new start. But in reality, it was that sense of feeling you'd get when you realize that all your worldly possessions really meant nothing when properly laid out. Yet, instead of dealing with that foreboding sense of dread, it's easier to just collect more clutter to pretend your life has more substance than it actually does. That's what Laura and I agreed on anyway. Once the unpacking was finished up, we kicked back on our tiny little sofa. We were on a little island of boxes in an otherwise empty living room. We didn't have too much to say to each other that night. The long day of shepherding boxes from one place to another left us exhausted. It was right about that time, when we had finally closed our eyes together, that we heard a knock on the door. It took me a few seconds, but I forced myself up. I could feel my back crack just under my skin at every little movement. I knew I'd be sore for a while, but I still pressed on to my front door. I unlocked our deadbolt and pulled open the thick wooden frame.
"Hello, neighbor."
A voice had filtered out towards me. It was an aged voice with the consistency of sandpaper. My eyes locked with the gaze of my visitor. It was just an elderly old man. His face was weathered with deep canyons of valleys of wrinkles. Deep shadows of the setting sun casted his face in black silhouettes that displayed the contours of his age. He wore an ebony black wide-brimmed hat with a dark overcoat that hung over his slender shoulders. He smiled with all the effort it took for a man who had already hit that venerable old age of carelessness. "Hey, sorry, we just moved in," I replied. "I don't think we've met yet. Is there anything I can do for you?" I asked the aged senior. He just shook his head in steady dismissal.
No, nothing like that. I just wanted to give you a proper welcome to Haidenfield. My name's John Clark. I'm the block president here.
He extended one of his lanky hands towards me. I took his hand in mine and shook it. His skin felt like tanned leather, but his grip was strong. Well, thank you for the welcome. Sorry we didn't have time to meet with the neighbors yet. We had a pretty busy day. John tightened his lips and nodded in understanding.
Nonsense. We should be apologizing to you both. Had we been younger, we'd have helped you out with those boxes. But I think those times are long past us now.
John gave a half-hearted chuckle.
Listen, we pride ourselves in this town for our hospitality. If you need anything at all, please, don't hesitate to ask. My wife Mary and I love having company. And we live in that blue house right next door.
I gave a small tired smile back to the old man. Thanks, John. I'll pass that on to my wife.
Good. Tell you the truth, none of us even lock our doors at night. I promise you, if you need anything at all, just walk right in.
His smile faltered with just a twitch at the end of his words. His eyes focused deep into mine. Well, I appreciate that offer. I promise we'll knock first, though. I gave a half-hearted laugh. The old man's expression didn't change.
Whatever makes you feel more comfortable here. Just remember, always keep hospitality first. Around here, we're all guests within each other's homes.
He squeezed my hand tightly, making me realize that he had never let go of me in the first place.
Be safe.
His leathery hand tightened over mine one last time before he let go. The old man dipped his chin slightly in a small bow of respect, his wide brim hat dipping below his eyes and casting his face into total darkness.
Our doors are open for you, Gregory, at any time, no matter the hour.
With that, John swung around and turned back towards my driveway. His black overcoat billowed off of his small frame with beautiful grace. I squinted my eyes towards him, trying to find the words to the strange feeling I had over the situation. Something about that interaction had given me a terribly uncomfortable feeling. I couldn't place my finger on it, though. I slowly shut my door and locked the deadbolt behind the old man. I shook off the nerves that tumbled down my spine and returned back to the barren living room of my new home. Laura had found herself laying half asleep on the couch, her body sprawled across the cushions. "Who was that?" Her small voice murmured out towards me. "A neighbor. His name's John. He lives in that blue house right next to ours with his wife." Laura twisted her body and stretched out on the empty couch, yawning. Her voice pushed past her inhale. "Oh, was he nice?" she asked through her tired tone. "Yeah, he just seems a little strange." I paused for a moment, judging how much space was left on the couch past Laura's small frame. "Hey, let's head upstairs before we both pass out down here. Otherwise, one of us is going to end up sleeping on the floor." Laura laughed before pushing herself up. We both went upstairs to our unfurnished bedroom. The only thing we had set up was a queen-size box spring with a matching mattress that lay on top of it. The box spring had found itself laying haphazardly on the hardwood of our floor. We ended up both sluggishly making our usual nest of pillows and blankets. Before long, we were both blacked out for the night. It wasn't until a few hours later I had felt a pressure on my chest that was shaking me awake. I looked over to the small silhouette of Laura next to me, the silvery moonlight from our window casting an ethereal light over her figure. "Greg, wake up." Laura's voice sounded panicked and subdued. I could hear how terrified she was, even underneath her hushed tone. What's going on?" I replied. My hand had tried to wipe away the sleep from my eyes. My body still felt exhausted from the physical labor we had just finished. "I heard the downstairs door slam shut. I think someone broke in." I looked at Laura and held my breath. I was trying to hear if anything else in our home was making noise. All I could hear was the throbbing of my own heartbeat. The rest of the house was dead quiet. Not a single crack of the aged wooden floorboard had met itself in contrast to our mutual silence. "I'll go check it out," I whispered over to Laura. She let go of my chest, and I lurched myself upward. I had wished I had a gun, or a bat, or anything I could have used to defend myself. But I had nothing more than the mattress on the floor to protect myself with. But I swallowed that feeling and pressed on. I slowly opened up my bedroom door and crept downstairs. Nearly every step I took sent a loud creak that echoed its way throughout the empty house. I kept telling myself that nothing could be inside our home and be this silent. Not unless it was standing completely still. I entered our moonlit living room and flipped on the lights. Nothing. I pressed forward into the kitchen and did the same thing. Nothing. Finally, the foyer. Nothing. I looked over to the front door and saw the deadbolt latch still flipped towards the locked position. I felt my body relax. My shoulders slumped down in relief. I took a deep breath and wandered back up into our bedroom. There's no one down there. The door's still locked. Laura just stared at me for a moment. "I know what I heard, Greg. Someone slammed the door shut." I could see the absolute resolve in Laura's eyes. I knew she fully believed in what she had heard. "Listen, I don't know. Everything's locked up tight down there. No one's getting in without breaking down that door." I laid back down on the mattress next to my wife. She just stared towards our bedroom door, as if she had expected something to break through it. Both of our physical fatigues ended up hitting their limits a few moments later, and we found ourselves asleep once again. But the same surprise came again and again, night after night. Laura would wake me up sometime just after 2 a.m. and tell me she heard our front door slam shut. I would head downstairs, see nothing, and check the lock to find everything in order. It wasn't until the evening of the fourth night, well after we had finished moving in, that I had made a disturbing discovery with our door. The lock didn't actually work. The deadbolt didn't transition over, no matter how hard you twisted the locking mechanism. The door had been unlocked every single night since we had first moved in. I was at a crossroads. I could break the news to Laura and have her lose even more sleep than she already lost, or make the decision to just handle things myself and buy a new deadbolt from the department store in the morning. So, I did what I thought was best. I told Laura I would sleep on the couch that night and keep an eye on the door. I didn't tell her about the broken lock. She went upstairs to our bedroom while I laid down on our couch. I decided to grab a kitchen knife for protection, just in case. I stole the largest one that I could find from our knife set. It was about the deadliest thing I could think of. I positioned our couch so that it faced our foyer. My vision was dead set on our front door for the first few hours. I did my best to keep them open that night, but a few hours in, and my eyes felt heavy. My mind had found itself halfway to dreamland and halfway to reality. So, when I watched the dimly lit front door in front of me slowly crack its way open, I couldn't muster up the energy to move. Even when my brain had begun to scream at me to do something, my body was paralyzed. I could only watch as the brass handle of the door slowly unlatched itself and the thick wooden door creaked its way open. The darkness from outside had spilled forward. The shadows casted an uncanny black shade throughout our foyer. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't make out a single figure in the emptiness of the void outside. But I could see one thing. I could see an arm that had extended its lanky fingers around the exterior of our doorknob. It was gangly, with a pale red hue that seemed unnaturally colored. Spindled of blackened veins intertwined themselves, with knots of tumor-like growths all along its skin. The arm was so thin it could be mistaken for a discarded tree branch. Yet, the thing's arm was impossibly long for its slender and atrophied frame. The forearm alone had to have been at least 4 or 5 feet in length. Its upper arm was even more so. The limb stretched deep into the darkness of the night outside. I couldn't even see the shoulder that the stick-like appendage should have been connected to. The entirety of the creature's body was completely cloaked in the shadows from outside. Meanwhile, I watched helplessly as the door creaked its way more and more open. The door had nearly reached the limits of its hinges before it paused. A few seconds passed before the fingers of the creature had tightened around the brass door handle. With a single tug, the door flew backwards. The full force of the wood slammed shut with such an impact that the intensity of it alone shook the house. I finally snapped out of my paralysis. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat pour down my forehead. I heard my bedroom door bang open, and the thudding of my wife's feet sprint downstairs towards me. "Greg?" she yelled out as soon as she saw me. I looked at her and knew immediately she could see the expression on my face, the absolute petrified expression. "Greg, what happened? Did you see anything?" I couldn't formulate the words out of my mouth. I just nodded. We stayed up the whole night with each other. As soon as the department store opened, I made the drive over. Funnily enough, the local store didn't sell any type of door lock. But ever determined, I drove out the extra hour to a chain store and got exactly what I needed. By the early afternoon, I was taking off my old deadbolt and affixing on the new one. My tired mind was barely able to comprehend the task I was doing.
"Hello, neighbor,"
a raspy voice had called out from behind me. I turned towards the blistering sun and saw the outline of John wearing his wide brim hat right behind me.
"What are you doing?"
I sighed and continued on. "I'm fixing up our locks. I just noticed last night that they weren't working." I pushed my fingertips against my eyelids and tried to force some of my exhaustion out.
"I wouldn't worry about that. None of us ever lock up our doors."
John continued to stare down at me. I couldn't make out his expression through the blinding light that lit his slender figure. Yeah, well, I'd feel safer if I did. I muttered to myself. I grabbed the new lock and placed it into the now empty hole of the front door.
"You won't be. The hospitality of an open door policy is what keeps this neighborhood safe. Always has been. Ever since I was a kid. A lot of people had to get hurt to realize that."
A silence enveloped us as I continued about my task.
"Gregory, if you finish what you're doing, you're going to get yourself and your wife hurt. No, I can't say much more than that. But you need to trust in your neighbors."
I scoffed under my breath before I turned towards John. I created a visor for my eyes using my hands. The makeshift shade helped me see the sour expression on my neighbor's face. "Listen, John, I get it. You're a close community here. But we've been having issues with our front door opening since we got here. That's stopping tonight." John slowly shook his head in disappointment.
"I can't compel someone to have good manners. Compelled hospitality is no hospitality on behalf of the compulsor. I'd be damned if I forced your hand here. But there are things out there that don't like locked doors. They've got to feel welcomed. Otherwise, our whole neighborhood falls apart."
I felt my brow furrow as I looked closer at John's face. I felt a kinship of understanding between us. I felt like he knew more than he was letting on. "What's going on here?" I whispered up to the old man.
"It's unbecoming to talk about someone behind their back."
He paused.
"Mary's making a pie for you tonight. I'll leave it on your doorstep. Don't eat it. It's for your guests tonight."
John took a deep breath and muttered,
"I hope it will be enough,"
under his breath. The old man swung his back towards me and began to walk back toward his house. I ignored him and fixed up the door. I made sure it locked up tight as soon as I was finished. Sure enough, just a few hours after Laura had returned home, we had a knock on our door. I opened the door and discovered a large steaming fresh apple pie. It had found its home resting upon our stoop. A small card lay near it. It read, for the guests of Gregory and Laura Adams, from the neighborhood of Haidenfield. We apologize for making you feel unwelcome tonight. Please accept our deepest apologies. Very respectfully, the Clarks. P.S. Gregory, a proper dessert should always be set out on your kitchen table in case any guests make an unexpected visit. May you have room on your dining room table to place this in case that may happen. God bless. John. Laura and I both gave each other a strange glance. What's all that about? She asked, flipping the card around in her hand. No idea, I replied, examining the pie in my hands. The aroma wafted over our home in the most pleasant of ways. Shall we have a slice? Laura leaned down and smelled the apple cinnamon scent that had been emanating from the glaze inside. I pulled it away from her. Something in me told me that John knew something we didn't. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew what the card said, and I knew what I had seen the night prior. Let's just leave it on the table tonight. We can double check with the neighbors tomorrow, just to make sure they actually made it. Otherwise, I don't know if we can trust it, you know? I tried my best to explain it away, but Laura gave me a skeptical look. Thankfully, she just shrugged it off. I placed the card and the pie right on the center of the dining room table and headed upstairs. Laura managed to fall asleep before I did. That night, I felt my eyes stare deep holes into my eyelids. No sense of drowsiness had washed over me. I could only think of that strange, spindly arm that I had seen the prior night. Like clockwork, just after 2 a.m., I had heard a jingle come from my downstairs foyer. The doorknob was shaking. It was slow at first, but then got more frantic. I gripped onto my bed covers and prayed that the lock would keep whatever that thing was away. But as the door handle jiggled more and more fiercely, that prayer fell away. I could hear the door begin thudding in its own frame as something lurched against it. At this point, Laura must have heard it as well. She shot up in bed and looked over at me. Greg? What the hell was that? Something began crashing against the door. A chorus of strange voices began screaming from outside our home. Their harmony created an ethereal echo that filled every inch of our home. I glanced over to our bedroom's window and saw several spider-like hands pressed against the glass. Their skin was the same twisted red hue that I had seen the night prior. Their gnarled fingertips had pressed so tightly against the glass that the glass had begun to crack under the grip. The same crackling noise had filled our entire home, as every window in our house had simultaneously begun to experience the same fate. Laura's eyes had fixated themselves on the gangly hands outside. Tears had welled up in her eyes as her voice faltered and fell away into a low whimper. I didn't know what to do, so I reached over to her and pulled her tightly against my chest. Don't look at them, I whispered to her over and over again. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to myself. I heard the front door splinter open under the weight of something incredibly massive. A tremendous tundra of thudding and thumping had filled the lower floor. Soon to follow was the sounds of every window in our home shattering open one by one. I squinted my eyes open for just a moment to see the bedroom window crack and explode into shards of glass. Broken shards had flown their way towards me and my wife. I closed my eyes to protect them from slivers of flying glass. The hands from outside had begun to stretch their way into my home. They seemed to lurch their way into our direction, as if they could see us. I closed my eyes again and began praying. The thudding from downstairs had found its way into our kitchen. The sounds of cabinets clattered open and shut. The symphony of voices floated their way into the halls of our home. I was left waiting for the feeling of those lanky hands to wrap over me. I was preparing myself to be dragged out of my home at any moment. To feel them pull me right through the broken glass-filled window and into the mouth of whatever those arms were connected to. But instead, I was greeted by silence. The banging had stopped. All the noises had stopped. I could hear Laura crying in my arms, but that was it. I opened my eyes and saw nothing more than the shattered window of my bedroom greeting me. I quickly picked up a large piece of glass and wrapped it up in one of my socks before getting up to my feet. Room by room, I cleared. Every window in our home was broken, every single one. I got to our front door and saw its frame completely knocked off its hinges. Broken splinters of wood lay scattered across the hardwood floor. Yet the thing that got me the most was that the pie was gone. We stopped locking up our doors after that night. Now we're always prepared to entertain any guests that might show up, no matter the time. One of the hardest things I've ever had to do was help my father and grandfather move my great-grandfather into an old folks' home. He was an old-school, greatest generation type, staunchly independent veteran. And after the 5th time he fell at home, my family decided he couldn't live on his own anymore. The house was purchased shortly after he returned from Europe, after the cessation of World War II, and had housed him and my great-grandmother for longer than I've even been a thought in my father's head. Getting him to leave, of course, was much harder than merely packing up all of his belongings. If he wasn't in a wheelchair, I'm sure he would have tried to literally fight us off. "I didn't raise you to act like this," he'd protested to my grandfather, who ignored him. My father was his next victim. "You just want the house, don't you?" My great-grandfather growled as another box was packed for storage. I guess I was too young for him to blame at the time. So, however challenging the situation was for the rest of the men in my family, I was just pleased to spend more time with him. He was an artist, painting well into his old age, and every room of his house seemed to be packed with still life and portraiture done in confident oils. After my great-grandmother passed, he'd hardly leave his art studio. My job was to sort through stacks and stacks of paintings, and sort them to decide which ones we kept and which ones would be sold. My great-grandfather exclusively painted from life, so it was baffling to me when I came to the bottom of a stack and found a painting that was decidedly not. It was old, much older than the rest of his work, and the sealant had already started to yellow and crack. The brushwork was rough, further from realism than his more skillful renditions of bowls of fruit and paintings of his children. He must have completed it as a much younger man. The subject matter was vastly different than anything I've seen him create. A sneering old man, beckoning to the viewer, with a snarling, wolf-like animal hovering above the sinister figure. It was disturbing. As far as I'd known, my grandfather had come away from his combat shockingly well adjusted. Not perfect, but he hadn't ever indicated anything dark about his psyche in the same way this painting did. Other members of my family were nowhere to be found, so it was the perfect opportunity to ask my great-grandfather about the work myself. Usually my father would discourage me from bothering him, but my great-grandfather loved to spin a good yarn. How could I have known this would be any different? I slunk out of the art room, careful not to be spotted, and presented my great-grandfather with the canvas. "Where did you find this?" he asked, a hint of something in his voice that I couldn't place. Tension or weariness. Nothing I'd experienced in my life at that point had given me the tools to identify when someone was confronted with what I now recognize to be trauma. I was a teenager, but I suddenly found myself feeling like a scolded child. "It was with the other paintings," I replied sheepishly. I wanted to know why it's so different from the others. The man gave a heavy sigh, sinking deeper into his chair, and looking frail for perhaps the first time in his entire life. "Did you know I went home before the end of the war?" His eyes were piercing, but his voice was soft. I shook my head. This was the first time he'd ever mentioned it to me. He began to tell me a story I'll never forget. I was a radio operator aboard a B-24 bomber. Towards the end, there were only 8 of us on the crew. There should have been 10. One of our waist gunners was laid up with some kind of pneumonia, and the nose gunner was killed by enemy fire. He wasn't even there long enough for me to learn his name. This sounds callous, but I don't think it would have mattered much one way or another anyways, because we were shot down over German territory in 1943. Only 4 of us managed to bail out and make it to the ground alive. The Krauts rounded us up right away, blindfolded us, loaded us up in the back of a truck. I thought we were going to a prisoner of war camp. Instead, when they finally took the blindfold off, I found myself in a room that looked like a doctor's office. They had strapped me down in a wooden chair with leather straps. Real medieval stuff. An older man with round glasses and a thick German accent told me they were going to conduct some testing. I was shitting my pants. I was still a teenager, for Christ's sake. And here I was, in some Nazi laboratory, convinced they were going to infect me with every disease known to man. It must have been pretty apparent how scared I was, because the man patted me on the cheek and said, "Don't worry, it won't hurt a bit." His tone was soft, and the words had a slight whistle to them, which might have made him seem downright meek in any other context. The man wore a long lab coat, that looked oversized on his diminutive frame. Every hair on my body stood on end after he got close to me. Even the German soldiers keeping guard seemed to shrink away from him. I couldn't blame them. There was a hint of decay around the man, a raw, meaty smell, cloying. My stomach shriveled when I smelled it on his breath. Testing started without much of a warning. The overhead light shut off, and I was instructed to focus on a red pin light on the ceiling directly above the chair and visualize a deck of cards. The next test involved closing my eyes and drawing a picture of a room. Then I had to follow a flashing light as I repeated a list of words my captor dictated to me. Many of them weren't in English, or even in German. To this day, I don't know what language it was. After a few hours of testing, all in the same vein, the man must have gotten whatever result he wanted, because he said something to the guards, and they let me out. He smiled at me, thin and lipless. Congratulations. You get to move on to phase 2. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't passed. I just know that I never heard from anyone else who was captured that day again. I was given food and water, and then blindfolded again. I could tell I was on some sort of aircraft at one point, but they kept me so disoriented that I couldn't make out up from down. The next time they let me go, it was into an iron cell with a few other American men. They informed me that I was now a guest of the POW ship, known as Eisvogel. I'm sure it had some official name, but that's just what they called it in front of us. I'm sure they didn't want us reporting their top secret boat to any official channels on our end, on the off chance that we found our way out. They kept us way down in the belly of the ship. It was nauseating. The boat rocked constantly, and without a porthole or window, it was easy to get so wrapped up in the feeling that you vomited. I couldn't tell you how it was laid out, or how many people were on board, or even what it looked like before it got cracked in half. I just know there were about 6 cells down where I was, a mix of Americans, British, and Russian prisoners. Each cell was clearly supposed to house 2 men, but we were packed in groups of 4 or 5. Except one. Every morning, the guards would come by and feed everyone. Sometimes they'd taunt us, putting loaves of bread through the bars and yanking it back before we could grab it. Real childish stuff. Bist du hungrig? They'd laugh. Hungerst du? We wouldn't react, especially after we'd been down there for a while. There wasn't a point, and the taunting slowly stopped. But not for the cell at the end of the hall. There was one man in there. He'd react every time, pleading and crying, wailing like a toddler. The strangest part, though, was that he was clearly German. Not fluent because he had a German grandma, like my cellmate Weber, but a bona fide German man. Didn't speak a lick of English when we tried to tell him to shut up, and the Russians got what seemed to be a similar response. Weber said that the Germans wouldn't even refer to him by name. They just called him Hungry. Not that they called any of us by name, mind you, but we were all Du or Haftling to them. No nicknames for the rest of us. Maybe it made the experiments easier. After we ate in the morning, A scientist would come down, flanked by guards, and pick one of us out from each cell. Sometimes it was the odd little man from Phase 1 choosing, and sometimes it was a thinner, tall man with a mustache. They'd never choose hungry, just some of us regular prisoners. We'd then be blindfolded and taken to separate rooms, somewhere up a flight of stairs. My tasks basically always followed the same pattern. I was told there was a box in another room, and I had to draw what I believed would be in the box. If I took too long coming up with an idea, they'd dump ice water on me, or take turns hitting me with a thin switch of wood. I'd resisted a couple of times, but the whole thing seemed so moronic. It was easier to just make something up. At the end of this portion, a light would either flash red or orange. I remember one time I drew a portrait of a woman, and the light flashed green. I got to leave early that day, and got a whole afternoon to myself, in my cell. After the drawing portion, I put headphones on, connected to a radio tuned in to nothing. I was told to listen for coordinates in the static, so I'd rattle off numbers and they'd write them down. This would happen for hours. After a while, my mind would play tricks on me, make me think there really were numbers or coordinates or even voices. I'd repeat it to them, but it was meaningless. Hours and hours of meaningless hallucinations. Not all of us were doing the same things. None of the other men were artists, so none of them had the drawing portion that I had. Some were told to focus on making a light bulb turn on. One man, a British guy, Thomas or something, said he was hooked up to a bunch of electrodes and then injected with something that made him fall asleep. He swore that the crowds were recording his dreams on a little TV in there. At first, we were all afraid to talk about it with each other, but eventually, we realized that they didn't care. This was worse, I think. It means they didn't plan on letting us go. They only took Hungry out in the evening, once every couple of weeks. I was shocked when I got a look at him. Just some old man they had locked up in there. Pathetic, really, the way he snivelled and whined. Weber would translate for us. "Can't you just give me a bite?" Hungry would say. "It hurts. It hurts." "Shut up," they told him. Sometimes they'd even smack him around a little. He'd always come back a couple of days later. He'd be quiet for a little bit, before starting up again. "Ik sterbe. Ik verhungere." Going on and on about how he was starving, dying, and it was so cruel to treat one of their elders like this. He'll show them. Ridiculous. We started treating Hungry kind of like a joke. We'd make fun of him too, copy what he'd say. It wasn't right, but we figured he was some criminal anyways. And it's not like we had a lot to do. Sometimes the guards would even laugh. The Russians were more superstitious. They didn't speak much English. But when we'd start teasing Hungry, the Russian in my cell would try to discourage us. "None of that," he'd say. The guy would be gloomy, in the corner, sitting away from us. Clearly didn't want us messing with Hungry, or provoking him, for whatever reason. I think maybe that would have been the best, in retrospect.
I don't know for sure how long I was stuck there. Close to 9 months, most likely. But without a solid way to tell when night turns to day, it's basically impossible to tell when days turn to weeks and weeks turn to months. It was a void. I stopped existing. The last day I was there, the last night of Eisvogel, Weber and I were shooting the shit. There was clearly a storm happening, rocking the floor beneath our feet. So we were telling stories from back home to get through it without losing the only meal we had that day. Then we saw Thomas return from testing. The Germans on either side of him had to prop him up from under his arms because he was so weak. His nose was bleeding. My head hurts, he moaned. One of the men left him in the arms of the other as he went to open the cell. A third stood watch, armed, in case we tried to make a break for it. Not that there was anywhere to go. While this was happening, a wave surged beneath the ship, making the dim lighting flash and everyone wobble. This was unfortunate for Thomas, who was unable to stand. The guard holding him dropped him, and the man went flying towards the cell at the end of the block. Hungry's cell. A weathered hand reached through the bars. "Lass mich dir helfen," a quiet voice said. "Let me help you." The guards were getting their bearings, and one was calling on a radio. Hungry pulled Thomas up and held him tight against the bars. "Geschmeidig," he said, so supple. I heard a wild animal's snarl rip across the cell. Thomas thrashed and scrambled against the bars. I was shocked by how much he was moving, given his condition, until I realized the movement wasn't from him trying to escape. It was because he was being torn apart. The guard didn't even bother shutting our cell. In fact, he flung it open, and in stuttering English yelled, "Get out of here." Someone was firing a gun into Hungry's cell, which was answered only by a throaty, ugly sort of laugh. I didn't bother to turn around and look at what was happening. I just took the guard's advice and ran like I've never ran before. The level of the ship we were in turned out to consist of the single cell block, a locked staircase, a storage room, and an emergency hatch to the deck. This hatch, however, was on the other side of the room, which means we would have had to pass Hungry's cell to get there. I decided my best bet would be hiding in the storage room. One of the Russian men came with me, whispering what I assumed to be a prayer under his breath. Weber wanted to see if he could get any of the other cells open before whatever was happening killed them too. He asked me to help. I told him no. "You're a coward," he told me. And maybe I am, but it saved my life. I pressed myself between boxes of various shipping supplies, and the Russian with me did the same. The boat rocked again, and the lights flickered off again. This time, they stayed out. The only time I could see was through flashes of gunfire, blood and fire, crushed bones and crushed iron. Maybe I was praying too. Something howled. Men yelled in German and English and Russian, and whatever the fuck it was I was speaking when they had me do that first experiment.
way back when I was captured. Ich bin so hungrig, a voice rumbled, so low and deep I heard it through the chaos. I shrunk further back into the cave of boxes. My eyes were closed. My hands were pressed tight over my ears. Geschmeidig, Weich. Another wave sent the ice vocal nearly onto its side, and the storage room fell apart around me. Containers burst open against the wall, spilling first aid kits and life jackets and God knows what else. Something heavy landed against the Russian man, and he stopped speaking. My arm was pinned underneath a large metal cylinder, and I felt my fingers seize up as they lost blood. I didn't dare move. The hall had become silent. The air smelled like copper and wet dog. Something snuffled at the entrance to the storage room, which was mostly blocked by fallen boxes. "Are you hungry?" it asked me. I tried to pull away as quietly as possible, but it must have heard me, because a hand curled around a gap in the doorframe. I couldn't see it, but I felt the hot breath of the beast, and heard how impossibly large the hand was as it dug into the walls of the ship. At the other end of the room, the hatch creaked open. For a moment, rain and light flooded in, and in that gap, I saw it. The hungry thing. It saw me, too, with its hateful little eyes. Glittering, intelligent, ancient eyes. Au revoir, it told me. It loped towards the hatch, where it exited into the storm that raged above. At some point, I had stopped breathing. I caught my breath and wrenched my arm out from where it was trapped, leaving behind a few strips of skin that stung dearly where they were missed. The open hatch provided me with a way to see, lit by moonlight and an emergency light that had been flicked on at some point. A siren was keening. People were running. The Eisvogel passed over another wave, and I wiggled out of the room where items had shifted to clear the doorway. I took a life vest with me. Water was pouring in at a steadily increasing rate, even leaking through the locked doorway to the staircase. And some part of me knew it was my only chance for survival. I resolved to make it to the hatch before the water level rose to the point that I'd drown down there. It was very likely I would drown out there, but at least if I made it out, I'd die a free man. I pulled the life vest on and sprinted towards the hatch, slipping on warm meat and cold rain as I went. I managed to stay on my feet though, and grabbed the ladder. Pulling myself up sent electric pain through my shoulder and spine, but I pressed on. The deck was in similar shape to the prison level of the ship, gore-streaked and vile. But people were alive. Someone was herding people into a lifeboat, until a dark shape wrenched the man away and threw him into the roiling sea. I had my life vest. I had my plan. I ran past the others, still in the lifeboat, and threw myself over the railing. My throat sealed shut the minute I hit the freezing water. I couldn't even cough. All I could do was suffocate. But my body acted on autopilot, and somehow I managed to put several yards between myself and the Eisvogel before I could breathe again. I was so cold I was burning, but I managed to turn my stiff muscles and look just the once, at the prison ship that had been my home. It was sinking. Men were screaming. It was larger than I could have even guessed. There was blood in the water. I kept swimming. I moved away from that damned place until my mind and body shut down from exhaustion. And don't you know it, I managed to wake up inside of an American helicopter. They had lots of questions for me, but they were kind enough to let me rest first. Asked me if I could remember what they made me do, and if I could remember anybody on board. I don't know why, but I lied to them and told them it was all a blur. They seemed disappointed, but the shrink in the room said it was a trauma reaction, and that if I ever recalled anything, please give them a call. I had a real funny feeling about the whole thing. That nobody knew I was there. That nobody knew I was alive. Wouldn't it be easy to go from one survivor to no survivors? I just wanted to go home. Eventually, I did. My great-grandfather pulled out the photo album that was sitting near his wheelchair, opening to a page of him and my great-grandmother, holding a newborn baby. They both looked so happy. First thing we did when I got back was make your great-aunt Cindy there. He winked. I cringed. Gross, Pops. Such a prude, he said with a chuckle. Just like that no-good grandson of mine. At least you cared enough to look through my paintings. The man took another look at the painting I had brought him. That one never did turn out right. Couldn't ever get the face to match. He licked his lip absent-mindedly, and then continued. Son, did you know the first serial killer was a German man? Way back in the 1580s, animals in a village near Bedburg, Germany, were turning up dead. Sheep, goats, lambs, ripped to shreds. Then hunters started going missing. Women and children. Pregnant women had their unborn babies torn from their wombs. The victims were so brutally murdered that the first townspeople blamed a wolf. But a man confessed. Peter Stumpf. 25 years before he was captured, he claimed he'd made a deal with the devil. He could take the form of a wild beast, cursed with terrible hunger and power. In exchange, he'd been instructed to torture the innocent, babies and children, those beyond Satan's grasp. I bit my lip, trying to process what my great-grandfather was saying. Why are you telling me this? Look, he replied. He had flipped to a different page in the photo album. There was a sepia-toned photo of a group of World War I era German soldiers. His finger jabbed at one in particular, a short, bold man with round glasses. Men have always done terrible things for power. He tapped on a small article in the album, just beneath the photo of the soldiers. It was clearly clipped from a German newspaper, and although I couldn't read it, I understood why it was there. In the accompanying photo, there was a group of scientists. Among them, the bald man. He flipped to the next page. The first photograph was a room full of computers, being attended to by a variety of men and women. A date scrawled in the corner read 1951. At a computer in the far corner, partially obscured, was the same man.
I don't know what they were testing for back then, what the lights and screens meant. I don't know why I heard your great-grandmother's voice in the static. I don't think I ever will. The next photo was clearly more recent. 2 men in spacesuits, surrounded by a group of grinning men in lab coats. A short man near the front had a thin-lipped smile, not wearing the same round spectacles, but wearing glasses nonetheless. It was him, again. I don't think it was just the Germans looking for answers, messing with things best left alone. And I don't think anyone has stopped. The last photo, this one was very recent. Bright colors, celebrating a ribbon cutting a new NASA office in 2018. The man was there, unassuming, unaged since his first appearance in the album. I think mankind will always do terrible things for power. We yearn for it. We're hungry for it. And somewhere along the line, we made a deal with the devil. I am a former NASA scientific researcher. My division was in charge of studying deep-sea life, both fauna and flora, in the world's oceans. Here are some facts. 70% of the world is ocean. The deepest part of the ocean is not the Mariana Trench. There's tons of underwater cave systems further down, some quite large. We have not identified every life form down there. Knowing these, let me tell you why NASA fired me and a small team of fellow researchers from the Oceanographic Division, hired completely new personnel, and switched to space exploration. In their defense, I had no interest in continuing my research. Before I begin, I want to say that most of this division actually did study underwater life forms to varying degrees, but most researchers were not involved with the life forms that my team investigated. Therefore, no information about these events has been released to the public. At least, to my knowledge. I'm purposely going anonymous here, for many reasons, as the US government would prefer to keep this out of the public eye, and people have disappeared for far less in my profession. On an off note, it's deeply tragic what happened recently with the submarine that imploded. I think I'm correct in my suspicion on what caused it, of course. But it's not what the public was told. Anyway, I will now detail a few incidents that I think the public needs to be aware of. Case Study 1: Montecarlo Oil Rig Diving Incident. I was involved with a study that was sanctioned between NASA and a private corporation to investigate an unknown anomaly. Metal parts at the bottom of the rig had taken damage from an unknown source, and a dive team of 3 was sanctioned to investigate it. The dive did not go well. Something we'd never seen before was down there with the divers. We do not know much about it, but I can tell you what we do know. It resembles an extremely intelligent class of giant cephalopods, more intelligent than any other sea creature ever encountered. They are strong and carnivorous, and extremely large. It's theorized they purposely damaged the rig to lure humans deep down.
It's unknown what they normally eat, or why they sometimes decide to target humans. But it is clear they will not hesitate to eat us. The 3 divers that were attacked had little means to defend themselves. These cephalopods worked in unison, with an extreme understanding of human equipment. One cephalopod removed a diver's air tank from his back, while another removed his fins. Their tentacles have extreme suction and can attach to any object. Dive knives did not appear to damage their bodies, where in the past, divers have been able to fight off Humboldt squids and other cephalopods with them. A second diver was choked by a cephalopod from behind, as another created a distracting light display with its body, showing they had an understanding of how humans breathe. Note, they can flash and take on any color as it suits them, unlike other squids, but normally they resemble a black-blue color, which is almost imperceptible at the deep depths that they live, and explain in part how they are able to avoid discovery. Of course, none of us saw them coming in the research vessel up top, and it was too late to warn anyone. The 2 divers who were attacked perished, and we can only assume they were likely consumed. Amazingly, the 3rd diver was able to use an underwater flare to escape and report back the events in detail. As it stands, fire is this life form's only known weakness. Case Study 2: USS Cyclops Missing Ship Log Recovery. What began as a normal shipwreck investigation has arguably become one of the biggest cover-ups in history. The ship's location has not been released to the public, and I agree that it should be kept secret. The beings that took that ship down there should be avoided at all costs. To this day, the public does not know anything other than that a US ship disappeared. Perhaps these creatures can be blamed for other missing ships, though we cannot prove that. This ship had a log that detailed the same beings encountered at the Monte Carlo oil rig. Black, blue, giant squid-resembling entities that work in teams and can use tools of human creation. These cephalopods engaged the ship at night in a surprise attack and damaged it beyond repair. They dragged down survivors, including many from atop lifeboats, using their tentacles. They left no trace of their encounter. They are clearly incredibly strong and can easily hold humans underwater, drowning them. There's a theory that they may even derive pleasure in killing, shown by them flashing certain patterns on their bodies immediately upon the taking of a life, although this is still just a theory. There are other incidents that I won't get into here. I don't intend to scare people by bringing this information to light, but I do think divers and people who are interested in using submersibles to investigate the deep sea need to be warned. These creatures normally stay in very, very deep water, and there's only a few incidents of human interaction. For the common person, they generally pose no threat. While extremely intelligent, they have not shown the ability to create tools, only to use those which humans have made. It is likely that they only go after humans when they are unable to find sufficient food sources in their own environments. We believe them to be just another species of giant squid, albeit an extremely intelligent one. I cannot understand why our government is hiding their existence, as they are just natural sea predators, like sharks and orca whales. But whatever the reason, remember this. Humans are not the top predators in the deep ocean. Naturally, NASA has chosen to avoid further exploration of the deep sea, for now, to avoid contact with these creatures until the proper measures are put in place.
Hello, Sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.